Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, where curiosity takes the slow road and mystery settles in like a familiar evening breeze. Tonight's story is one that humankind has been telling for thousands of years, whispered on clay tablets and carved into temple walls long before the first clock ticked or the first page turned. It's a story of gods and kings, of earth and sky, of how civilization itself began under the watchful eyes of beings who might not have been entirely human. So, settle in, wherever you're listening from. Maybe it's night where you are. Maybe the soft hum of traffic outside your window is the only thing moving through the present moment. Either way, you're here, and that's a fitting place to start. Because this story begins before there was a here, before there was a now. It begins in the time when gods ruled the earth. Before we step into that world, let me ask you something. Have you ever looked up at the stars and felt the faint sense that someone or something might be looking back? That the glow scattered across the sky might be more than distant suns? That it might be memories, messages, or even homes? The people of ancient Mesopotamia thought so. To them, the heavens were not a cold emptiness, but a realm alive with intention. Every star, every flicker of light had meaning, and above them all were the Anunnaki, the skyborn gods who shaped the world below. If you find stories like this soothing, the kind that blend myth and wonder and history into something that helps the mind rest, I'd be grateful if you left a like or subscribed. It helps this little corner of calm find others who enjoy drifting through the deep roots of human curiosity. And if you're already part of this journey, thank you. Let's begin. The name Anunnaki itself carries an echo of something ancient and immense. In Sumerian, it roughly means those who came from the heavens, or the princely offspring of Anu. Anu was the Sky Father, the highest of the gods, ruling from above while his children and their descendants managed the world below. To the people of Sumer, who lived more than 5,000 years ago along the fertile valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, the Anunnaki were not distant figures. They were part of the world, shaping rivers, guiding rulers, and, according to some texts, even fashioning humankind itself. Their presence was woven into the fabric of daily life. Each temple, each offering, each grain harvested under the sun was, in some way, tied to the divine order that Anunnaki maintained. But let's not rush toward conclusions. Myths like these weren't written as entertainment the way we think of stories today. They were explanations, attempts to make sense of existence. Imagine standing on the banks of the Euphrates thousands of years ago, seeing the water rise and fall with the seasons, watching storms carve their path across the desert sky, witnessing life and death and renewal without any modern framework to explain it. For the Sumerians, it made sense that there were powers behind these forces, beings of immense authority who governed nature and destiny, and so they named them, shaped them, and built entire civilizations around their favour. The first known stories of the Anunnaki come from Sumer, one of humanity's earliest and most sophisticated cultures. Here, people built cities like Uruk, Ur, and Eridu, names that even now seem to hum with myth. The Sumerians invented writing, etched into clay tablets that somehow survived thousands of years buried in the earth. When archaeologists began finding these tablets in the 19th century, they realized they were touching one of the oldest recorded voices of humankind. These tablets spoke of gods who walked the earth, of kings who ruled by divine appointment, of floods, wars, and the creation of mankind. And woven through it all was the name of the Anunnaki. According to these records, the Anunnaki were not just one god, but a pantheon, a council of deities who oversaw every aspect of existence. There were hundreds of gods in the Mesopotamian tradition, but the Anunnaki occupied the highest tier. They were often described as judges of destiny, determining the fate of both gods and men. They were not always benevolent, nor were they purely destructive. Like the natural world itself, they could nurture or destroy, bless or curse. To the ancient mind, divinity mirrored life, complex, unpredictable, and often beyond comprehension. It's easy to imagine how awe and fear would blend in a world like that. When lightning struck, it was the voice of Enlil, god of air and storms. When the rivers flooded, it was the work of Enki, god of wisdom and water, reshaping the land. Each act of nature was a gesture of the divine, and humans were both participants and spectators in this cosmic theatre. To the Sumerians, the line between mortal and god wasn't as rigid as we imagine. There were stories of gods descending to earth, of humans ascending to godhood, and of offspring born between both realms. It was a world where the sacred and the mundane coexisted, and the Anunnaki were its bridge. As time went on, these stories evolved. The Sumerian gods were adopted and adapted by later civilizations, the Akkadians, Babylonians and Assyrians, each adding new layers to the myth. What began as the Anunnaki became, in some texts, the Agigi, a term for the younger gods who served them. There were tales of rebellion, of labour and creation, of gods who grew weary of toil and fashioned humans to share the burden. These myths didn't just explain the origins of life, they reflected the structure of society itself. The gods worked, ruled and argued just as people did. In many ways, the Anunnaki were mirrors of humanity, magnified and eternal. One of the most striking things about the Anunnaki legends is how they blend cosmic and earthly elements. They're celestial beings, but their dramas unfold in recognizable places, cities, temples, fields. They rule from heaven, but they walk among people. Some texts describe them as descending from the stars to teach humanity the arts of civilization, agriculture, writing, law. Others speak of them as taskmasters, demanding worship and obedience. It's this duality, the nurturing teachers and the commanding overseers, that keeps the Anunnaki myths alive in our imagination even today. They embody the eternal human question. Are we children of the stars, or simply storytellers reaching for them? When modern scholars first translated these texts, they were amazed by the depth and complexity of Sumerian mythology. But others, especially in more recent decades, saw something even more extraordinary. Writers like Zecharia Sitchin proposed that the Anunnaki were not gods in the symbolic sense, but literal beings, extraterrestrial visitors from a distant planet, perhaps Nibiru, who arrived on Earth thousands of years ago. According to this interpretation, humanity's sudden leap into civilization wasn't just a natural evolution, but a collaboration, or perhaps an intervention. The gods, they argued, were not metaphors. They were advanced beings mistaken for deities by early humans who couldn't comprehend their technology. It's a bold idea, one that stretches from archaeology into science fiction, and yet it resonates because it taps into something deeply human. Our longing to understand where we came from and why we're here. Even if we set aside the theories of alien intervention, the underlying fascination remains. The Anunnaki represent creation, order, power and mystery, the same elements that drive all civilizations to question their beginnings. Whether they were gods, symbols, or something else entirely, they left an imprint that refuses to fade. When you think about it, the story of the Anunnaki isn't just about ancient Sumer, it's about us. We're still writing versions of the same story. We give it new names, aliens, ancestors, higher powers, destiny, but the pattern repeats. We imagine beings greater than ourselves who came before us, guided us, or still watch over us. It's a thread that runs from the oldest myths to the newest movies, from temple carvings to satellite dishes scanning the sky. We may no longer call them Anunnaki, but we're still searching for them. In a way, that's what makes the story so compelling. It doesn't matter whether the gods truly walked among us or not. What matters is that people once believed they did, and that belief built cities, shaped laws, and inspired art that still endures. The ruins of Sumer, the ziggurats of Ur and Eridu, the tablets written in wedge-shaped cuneiform, all of it stands as evidence of a world that once looked at the stars and saw family, not distance. So as we begin this journey into their story, remember that every myth carries more than magic. It carries memory. The Anunnaki may belong to an age-long past, but their echoes are woven through every civilization that followed. And perhaps, if we listen closely enough, through us as well. Let's move deeper now, back to that ancient cradle where the first stories of the gods began, in the shadow of rivers and the glow of 1,000 stars reflected in the waters of a world still being made. The world we know began in silence, in a stretch of land that would one day be called Mesopotamia. Between two rivers that curved like silver threads through the earth, people began to gather, build, and wonder. The soil was rich, the waters generous, and for reasons we may never fully understand, something extraordinary happened there. From mud and reed, from labour and prayer, civilization took its first breath. Long before pyramids reached for the sky or philosophers filled scrolls with questions, there were these early settlements of farmers and dreamers who looked upward at the night sky and believed that every light above them was alive. In their minds, stars were not distant suns but watching eyes, the lamps of the Anunnaki, the gods who walked before men, the architects of their world. It's strange to think how natural that belief must have felt. When the sun rose, it was a god's movement. When storms rolled through, it was a god's temper. When crops flourished, when they failed, when children were born or taken too soon, it was all the echo of divine will. There was no separation between nature and power, no border between sky and spirit. Everything that existed carried the fingerprints of those unseen beings who shaped the world. The Sumerians didn't need proof of their gods. Their entire existence was the proof. Every harvest, every flood, every heartbeat was evidence that they were living inside a divine design. The first cities rose slowly along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. At first they were clusters of huts and fields, held together by nothing more than the shared rhythm of survival. But over generations those small clusters turned into city-states, places like Eridu, Uruk and Ur. Each one had its own temple, its own god, and its own interpretation of where humanity fit in the cosmic order. Eridu, the oldest of them all, was said to be the home of Enki, the wise and merciful god of water and creation. People believe that Eridu was the first city ever built, not by men but by the gods themselves. They called it the home of Kingship, the place where civilization began because the divine will had chosen it to begin there. When archaeologists later uncovered its ruins, they found layers upon layers of history buried beneath the sand, mud brick structures, fragments of pottery, remnants of ziggurats that had once touched the sky. Every layer told the same quiet truth. People had been here for longer than anyone had imagined, and they had built their world in the image of something greater. Writing began here too, in this same stretch of land where gods were said to have first walked. The earliest cuneiform tablets were not stories or hymns, but lists, inventories, trades, records of grain and livestock. But over time, those marks in clay began to capture more than commerce. They captured memory, and with memory came myth. People began writing the names of their gods, describing their deeds, recording prayers, questions, and warnings. The first stories of the Anunnaki appeared this way, pressed into clay by human hands, drying under the same sun that had once been worshipped as divine. Those tablets outlasted the cities that made them, waiting thousands of years to speak again. In the myths, the Anunnaki were described as a great assembly of gods who came to earth from the heavens. Their father, Anu, ruled the sky. His sons, Enlil and Enki, governed the air and water. Together they maintained the balance of all things. But like any family, their unity was never perfect. There were rivalries, jealousies, alliances, and betrayals. The ancient stories don't paint them as flawless beings of pure light. They are powerful, but they are emotional, impulsive, and deeply entangled with the fate of humankind. They punish and reward, destroy and restore. In their image, humanity itself was made, capable of both creation and destruction. When the Sumerians spoke of their gods, they didn't mean it metaphorically. They truly believed the Anunnaki had physical forms, that they descended from the sky and built the first cities alongside mortals. Temples were not places of abstract worship, but literal meeting grounds, the bridges between heaven and earth. The priests who served there weren't just spiritual guides, they were intermediaries, trained to communicate directly with divine forces. Rituals, chants, and offerings weren't symbolic gestures, they were dialogues, negotiations with powers that governed everything from rainfall to kingship. And so, life itself became a kind of conversation between man and God, a constant effort to maintain balance and favour. In Eridu, at the Temple of Enki, the god of wisdom was believed to dwell in the waters beneath the earth. His domain was not just the rivers, but the deep, unseen currents of knowledge that flowed through all things. To please him, priests performed purification rituals with sacred water, believing that through these acts they could connect to the source of creation itself. In Uruk, Inanna, goddess of love and war, was worshipped with grand processions and sacred ceremonies. Her presence symbolized fertility, passion, and the unpredictable duality of existence. In Nippur, Enlil was honored as the great authority of the heavens, the one who decreed fates and gave legitimacy to kings. The more you look at these gods, the more they resemble a reflection of human society, hierarchies, duties, emotions, and ambition all projected onto the cosmic scale. It's tempting to romanticize it all, to imagine golden temples, slow-moving rivers, incense curling into the air while chants echo through the dawn. But life in ancient Mesopotamia was hard. Floods destroyed fields, droughts brought hunger, invasions and diseases were constant threats. The gods weren't distant luxuries of imagination. They were necessities of survival. When the world was cruel, people needed reasons. They needed stories that made sense of chaos, so they built order through belief. Each offering, each prayer, each ritual was a way to push back against the uncertainty that surrounded them. The Anunnaki, in that sense, were guardians of meaning as much as they were rulers of creation. As the centuries passed, Sumer's city-states grew more powerful and more connected. Trade routes spread out like veins across the region, carrying goods, ideas, and myths from one city to another. The stories of the Anunnaki travelled too, changing slightly with each retelling. In Akkad, they became the gods of empire. In Babylon, they evolved again, merging with new interpretations of cosmic order. Each generation reshaped them, just as they reshaped the world. Yet through every transformation, one theme remained: the belief that the gods had once walked the earth, had shaped humanity, and had eventually retreated, leaving behind both their wisdom and their absence. It's difficult not to see a kind of longing in these stories. The idea that once, long ago, the world was closer to the divine, that there was a time when the distance between heaven and earth wasn't so great, when the gods' voices could still be heard in the rustle of leaves or the flow of the river. That longing seems to echo through history itself, resurfacing in myths across cultures. The Greeks' Golden Age, the Hindus' Satya Yuga, the biblical Eden. They all speak of an original closeness between humanity and its makers, followed by separation and exile. The Sumerian version simply gave those forces names: Anu, Enlil, Enki, Inanna, and through those names the memory of that connection endured. When archaeologists unearthed the ruins of Uruk in the 20th century, they found something remarkable. Not only the remains of walls and temples, but also thousands of clay tablets, some still bearing the impressions of reed styluses. Among them were fragments of hymns, prayers, and administrative records, but also myths that would later influence the entire course of human storytelling. The Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, traces its roots to these same traditions. In that epic, gods walk among men, bestow wisdom, and decree death. Immortality is sought but never granted. The tone feels familiar even now, the same questions, the same yearning. How much of our destiny is ours to shape, And how much is written in the stars? That idea of written fate was central to the Mesopotamian worldview. The gods didn't just rule the present, they wrote the future. In some myths, the Anunnaki are said to hold the tablets of destiny, divine records that contain the fate of all things, from the life of a single person to the rise and fall of entire kingdoms. Whoever possessed those tablets held control over existence itself. It's a concept that carried tremendous weight because it implied that everything, every victory, every tragedy, was known in advance. But it also offered comfort. If fate was written, then perhaps even suffering had purpose. The unknown became bearable when it was part of a grand design. Of course, not every story about the Anunnaki was filled with harmony. In some accounts they quarrelled among themselves, jealous of power or weary of their responsibilities. There were tales of rebellion, of gods who defied their superiors and suffered for it. The line between divine and mortal struggles was thin, and through these stories people could see their own world reflected. Rulers vying for control, cities rising and falling, fortunes shifting like the tides of the rivers. Myth and history became intertwined. When kings of Sumer declared their rule, they often claimed divine descent, presenting themselves as chosen intermediaries between gods and men. In doing so, they weren't just asserting political authority, they were reaffirming the sacred order that sustained their civilization. Over time, the stories of the Anunnaki began to reach beyond Mesopotamia. Their echoes can be found in neighbouring cultures, subtly transformed but recognizable. The Akkadians called them by new names, the Babylonians folded them into their pantheon, and later still their influence rippled into Hebrew and Greek traditions. The flood myth, for instance, appears in Sumerian texts centuries before the story of Noah was ever written. The pattern is the same. Divine beings warn of a coming deluge, a chosen human builds a vessel, life is preserved, and a new age begins. The details shift, but the structure and the sentiment remain the same. It's a story about destruction and renewal, about the fragile balance between creation and chaos. Perhaps that's why it survived, retold in every culture that followed. Standing in a museum today, looking at one of those ancient tablets, it's hard not to feel a strange closeness to the people who made them. Their handwriting, if we can call it that, is still visible, careful, deliberate, steady. They pressed each mark into wet clay, probably unaware that they were speaking to the future. The language is dead now, but the thoughts are not. They were reaching for understanding, the same way we still do. Whether they called them gods, stars, or ancestors, they were trying to explain why we are here, why we build, why we dream. In that sense, every word they wrote still matters. The cradle of civilization was not only a birthplace of cities and writing, but of wonder. It was a place where imagination became infrastructure, where myth shaped reality. The Anunnaki, whether divine or symbolic, were the foundation of that transformation. They gave the people of Sumer a reason to believe that their lives were part of something vast and meaningful. They gave them structure in a world that could easily have felt random and cruel. And in doing so, they gave all of us a story that has never quite ended. From those early settlements and their first prayers, humanity learned to see the sacred in the ordinary, in water, in earth, in the turning of the seasons. The same impulse that led a Sumerian priest to offer grain to Enki is the one that drives a scientist today to look for life beyond our planet. Different tools, different languages, but the same hunger to understand what lies beyond the horizon. The Anunnaki may have been born from that hunger, or maybe they were its answer. Either way, their legacy is still with us, in our stories, in our faith, in the way we keep asking questions even when the answers stay just out of reach. The rivers still flow where Sumer once stood, carving through lands that have seen countless generations rise and fall. The cities are gone, their temples reduced to dust, but the whispers remain. They speak through the broken tablets and the half-remembered myths. They remind us that everything we build begins as belief, and every belief begins as a whisper, and somewhere in that whisper the gods are still listening. The story of the Anunnaki begins not on Earth, but in the heavens. The Sumerians looked up at the night sky and saw a kingdom stretched across eternity, ruled by a power so distant it could only be imagined, never approached. At its highest point sat Anu, the father of the gods, the keeper of divine authority, and the source from which all order flowed. He was not the god of storms or seas or crops. He was the sky itself, vast, silent, unreachable. Everything that existed beneath him, every force that moved or breathed was said to descend from his will. To the people of Sumer, he was the invisible ceiling of existence, the one who gave the heavens their shape and purpose. But like any ruler, he was not alone. Around him gathered his divine court, his children, and their children after them. A family that would rule the world both seen and unseen. To understand the Anunnaki is to understand this divine lineage, because their world, much like ours, was built on relationships. Parents, rivals, allies, offspring, each with their own strengths and flaws. In the beginning, there was only the sky and the earth. The earth was Ki, the mother, solid and patient. When she joined with Anu, the sky father, the first generation of gods was born. Their union created the bridge between heaven and earth, and through them came Enlil, the god of air and command. Enlil would become one of the most important figures in Mesopotamian belief, the one who carried out the decrees of heaven on the world below. Anu remained distant, watching from the highest heavens, but Enlil became the active ruler of the realms beneath. He was the god who separated the sky from the earth, allowing creation to unfold. Without him, there was only silence and shadow. With him came wind, motion, and the beginning of time as people understood it. He ruled not through kindness, but through order. His word was law, and his presence was both protective and terrifying. In later myths, he would appear as a figure who could bless nations or destroy them with the same calm authority. When cities rose, they built temples not only for Enlil's glory, but for his favour. To displease him was to invite ruin. To earn his blessing was to ensure prosperity. And then there was Enki, the other great son of Anu, but of a different nature entirely. Where Enlil represented command, Enki represented wisdom. He ruled not the skies, but the waters, both the rivers that nourished the land and the deep hidden springs that flowed beneath it. He was the god of creation, knowledge and mischief, a being whose cleverness often changed the course of both divine and human history. In some stories, it was Enki who shaped humanity, forming men and women from clay and divine essence. In others, it was he who defied the will of the other gods to protect his creations, teaching them skills, secrets, and survival. While Enlil governed through rules, Enki ruled through understanding. If the pantheon of the Anunnaki had a heart, it was divided between these two, one stern and distant, the other gentle but cunning. The relationship between Enlil and Enki was never simple. They were brothers in blood but not in temperament. One sought order, the other balance. Their differences shaped many of the stories that followed, giving the myth of the Anunnaki its depth and humanity. There were times when they worked together to build and bless the world, and others when their opposing visions brought conflict to heaven and earth alike. Their rivalry was not about personal hatred, but about the nature of power itself, the eternal tension between law and wisdom, between control and compassion. The Sumerians may not have had a modern philosophy, but through these stories they explored the same questions we still ask. What makes a ruler just? What makes creation endure? Anu's family extended beyond these two sons. There was Inanna, known later as Ishtar, the goddess of love, fertility and war. She was the daughter of Nanna, the moon god, who himself was a child of Enlil. Through Inanna, the Anunnaki's legacy reached into every corner of human experience. Passion, desire, conflict, ambition. She was adored and feared in equal measure, a goddess who could bless a union or tear apart an empire. Her temples stood at the centre of cities, her image carved into stone and etched into jewellery. People sang her praises and begged her for mercy. Unlike the distant Skyfather or the silent waters of Enki, Inanna's power was felt directly in the pulse of human life. She embodied contradictions that fascinated the ancient world. She was both a nurturer and a destroyer, a lover and a warrior, a symbol of creation and chaos. To the Sumerians, this wasn't a flaw. It was a reflection of truth. Life was never one thing. It was love and loss, peace and war, harvest and famine. Inanna was all of it at once. Her myths describe journeys into the underworld, challenges to authority, and acts of defiance that reshaped the cosmic order. In one story, she descends to the realm of the dead, defying the natural laws that even gods must obey. When she returns, she brings with her the wisdom of mortality, a reminder that even the divine are bound by the cycles of life and death. Among Anu's descendants were many others, each governing their own realm. Utu, the god of the sun and justice, rode across the heavens each day, watching over truth and order. His light revealed hidden things, ensuring that lies could not endure. His sister, Nanna, guided the moon through its phases, marking the passage of time. Ninhursag, the mother goddess, tended to the earth and all living beings. She was often seen as the counterpart to Enki, working alongside him in the creation of humanity. Each of these gods played a part in maintaining balance, their stories overlapping and intertwining in a vast web of meaning. To the Sumerians, this divine family was not just a mythological concept, it was a reflection of the structure of their own world. Just as the gods had a hierarchy, so too did society. Kings ruled by divine appointment, priests mediated between the heavens and the people, and workers served to maintain the harmony that the gods demanded. The concept of family, of lineage and responsibility, ran through both divine and mortal existence. When a new ruler rose to power, he often claimed descent from one of the gods, asserting his place within that celestial bloodline. It wasn't simply a matter of prestige, it was a declaration of legitimacy. If you were a child of the gods, then your rule was natural, unquestionable, and eternal. Anu himself remained distant from these earthly matters. He was invoked in rituals but rarely appeared in stories. His authority was absolute, but his touch was seldom felt. That was the nature of ultimate power, remote, invisible, and unquestioned. The true drama of divine life played out among his children and their children, whose emotions and actions gave shape to the world. Enlil governed from Nippur, issuing decrees that bound gods and men alike. Enki worked from Eridu, his sacred city, where the waters of wisdom flowed. Inanna's shrines rose in Uruk, the beating heart of devotion and trade. The geography of Mesopotamia mirrored the map of heaven, each city a reflection of a god's domain. One of the most enduring tales involving the children of Anu tells of a time when the lesser gods grew weary of their labours. The Anunnaki, for all their grandeur, were not immune to fatigue. They toiled to maintain the world, to dig canals, shape mountains, and guide the cycles of nature. In some accounts, it was Enki who heard their complaints. The gods gathered and demanded relief. They sought freedom from endless work. Enlil, as always, favoured discipline and order. He saw rebellion as chaos and would not bend. But Enki, ever the mediator, offered a different solution. He proposed the creation of a new being, one that could share the burden of labour. A being shaped from clay, infused with divine essence, capable of thought and will. This was the birth of humanity, at least as the Sumerians told it. Enki mixed clay with the blood of a sacrificed god, and from that mixture came the first people. They were neither divine nor entirely mortal, but something in between. Fragile, yet purposeful. They could build, farm, sing, and dream. The gods gave them language and law. In return, humans offered worship and service. It was an arrangement that benefited both sides, though not always equally. The Anunnaki rested, and humankind began its long journey of civilization. It was a partnership written in myth, but rooted in something far more real. The understanding that creation always comes with responsibility. The Sumerians didn't see this act as cruelty. To them, work was sacred. To labour in the fields, to craft pottery, to raise walls, all of it was a continuation of divine purpose. When they worked, they were imitating the gods who had shaped them. It was an act of reverence, not submission. This belief gave meaning to their daily lives and bound their society together. Every act, from planting a seed to building a temple, was a small echo of the first act of creation. Enki's compassion, however, often placed him at odds with Enlil's authority. There were times when Enlil's decrees brought hardship to humanity, droughts, floods, punishments for disobedience. And there were times when Enki quietly intervened, offering guidance or salvation. In one of the oldest flood stories ever recorded, long before the tale of Noah, Enlil decides to destroy humanity with a great deluge. He believes the people have grown too noisy, too restless, disrupting the order of the gods. But Enki, unable to watch his creation perish, warns a righteous man named Ziusudra. He instructs him to build a vessel, to gather his family and the seeds of all living things. When the flood comes, Ziusudra survives, and life begins anew. This act of defiance would echo through centuries, retold in new forms across cultures, but in its original version, it was more than a story of survival. It was a testament to Enki's nature, the god who valued life over law, mercy over power. His rebellion wasn't against the gods themselves, but against the cruelty that authority can bring when it forgets compassion. In contrast, Enlil's anger reflected the stern necessity of order. Without boundaries, without consequence, the world would fall into chaos. The balance between the two brothers defined existence itself. As the myths evolved, these divine dynamics became a way for people to explain the unpredictable nature of the world. Storms, floods, harvests, sickness, and fortune all could be traced back to the moods and decisions of the gods. It was not randomness, but relationship. To live in balance with a divine family meant to live in harmony with the world. To ignore them was to invite disaster. And so, temples became the heart of every city, where priests and rulers worked together to interpret the will of the heavens. Every offering, every ritual, was part of maintaining that cosmic family bond. Over time, Anu's children came to represent more than mere forces of nature. They became symbols of human qualities: strength, wisdom, desire, justice, and defiance. Through them, people could see themselves reflected in the heavens. Enlil's authority mirrored the discipline of leadership. Enki's creativity echoed human curiosity. Inanna's passion captured both love and ambition. Even their conflicts felt familiar, because they were the same struggles humans faced in their own homes and kingdoms. That was the genius of these stories. They made the infinite relatable, the divine understandable. When people prayed to the gods, they weren't just asking for miracles. They were participating in a dialogue that had begun with Anu and his children. A farmer offering grain to Enki was continuing the act of creation. A warrior praying to Inanna before battle was aligning with the forces of courage and chaos that she represented. Every act of devotion was an attempt to stay connected to the divine family that had made the world. And through that connection, the Sumerians built not just cities and empires, but a way of understanding existence itself. The lineage of Anu stretched endlessly, intertwining with history and myth until the two became inseparable. His children ruled not only heaven but imagination, and even as new gods rose and old ones faded, their essence endured. The people of Mesopotamia eventually vanished, their language forgotten, their temples swallowed by sand. But the children of Anu remain in our stories, in the archetypes that still shape our understanding of power, wisdom, and love. They are the echoes of that first cosmic family, still whispering through the ages, reminding us that creation, in all its beauty and complexity, is always born from relationship. And as we follow those whispers further, deeper into the stories that shaped the first civilizations, the heavens above Sumer still wait, vast and silent, filled with the memory of gods who once walked among men. Long before the first temple rose from the mud, before the first king claimed his throne or the first line of writing pressed itself into wet clay, there were stories about the day the sky opened. The people of Sumer said that the Anunnaki descended then, their brilliance spilling across the horizon like the birth of dawn. They were not spirits without form, nor distant ideas to be worshipped from afar. They came as beings of substance and power, walking the same ground as mortals, breathing the same air, commanding the forces that mortals could only watch. To the people who saw them, or believed they did, it was as if the universe itself had stepped closer. The air changed. The world no longer felt empty or indifferent. Every wind, every spark of fire, every rush of river water seemed to carry their intent. In those earliest days, the world was still young, half-formed and uncertain. The rivers that brought life also brought ruin when they rose too high. The earth gave crops but swallowed them again in drought. There was abundance, but there was also fear. To live was to be at the mercy of something vast and unknowable. So when people looked up and saw light moving through the heavens, or heard thunder roll from one end of the sky to the other, they imagined not nature but presence. The Anunnaki were the answer to that feeling, the bridge between helplessness and meaning. The tablets say they came from the heavens, from a place beyond the stars, from a realm that only gods could cross. The word Anunnaki itself carried this implication, those who came from the heavens to earth. Some translations describe them as the princely offspring of Anu, the divine emissaries of his will. Others speak of them as architects and judges, descending to organize the chaos of creation. Whatever their origin, their arrival marked the beginning of order. Before them, the earth was wild. After them, there were boundaries, laws, and life-shaped purpose. It's difficult to know how literally the Sumerians took these stories. To them, myth and reality were not separate categories. They overlapped like layers of the same dream. The descent of the gods could have been a metaphor for enlightenment, for the spark of civilization itself, or it could have been told as fact, the memory of a divine event passed down through generations. The people didn't distinguish between the two. What mattered was the meaning behind it, that life on Earth was not an accident, that humanity had been visited, taught, and shaped by those who came before. The earliest written accounts describe the descent in solemn, careful detail. The Anunnaki were said to have arrived in Eridu first, the oldest of cities where heaven and earth met. Enki, the god of water and wisdom, was their guide. He built his temple there, the Abzu, on the edge of the marshlands where fresh and salt water mingled, a place of beginnings. From there, civilization spread outward like ripples from a stone cast into a still pond. Other gods followed, establishing their own centres of power. Enlil ruled from Nippur, where the sacred mountain of heaven and earth stood. Inanna descended upon Uruk, bringing fertility and warfare, passion and power. Each god chose a city, and each city became a reflection of divine order. To the people who lived beneath their gaze, the gods were not distant rulers. They were neighbours, protectors, sometimes even participants in daily life. Temples were their houses, filled with the hum of priests tending fires, mixing incense, reciting chants meant to sustain the link between heaven and earth. Each morning began with offerings, each night ended with prayers. The gods were fed with devotion, clothed with praise, sustained by ritual. The people believed that as long as they kept this cycle alive, the world would remain in balance. Archaeologists have found traces of this belief everywhere across Mesopotamia. The ziggurats, those immense step towers that rose from the plains, were not meant as mere monuments. They were ladders of connection, stairways for the gods to descend and ascend. Each one mirrored the mountains of the divine world, bringing a piece of heaven to the flat earth below. The The top of each tower was said to be the resting place of the gods, the point where sky touched soil. From there, priests would make offerings of food and incense, sending smoke into the heavens as if to remind the divine family that their children still waited below. The symbolism is clear. The gods might have descended once, but the people never stopped calling them back. In one of the oldest hymns, a Sumerian poet described the descent as a moment of both awe and terror. The heavens trembled, the earth shook, and the waters rose as if bowing in submission. Light poured from the sky, not the soft light of dawn, but something fiercer, sharper, a brilliance that made day and night indistinguishable. The poet called it the arrival of radiance, a phrase that still stirs curiosity today. To some, it was a poetic metaphor for divine presence. To others, especially those who look for extraterrestrial explanations, it sounds like something else entirely. Whatever it was, it marked a change in how humanity saw itself. Once the Anunnaki had descended, the myths say they organized the world according to their design. They divided it into regions, each ruled by a god. Enlil was given command over the air and authority over all other gods on earth. Enki took the waters, both the rivers and the hidden abyss beneath. Nanna ruled the moon, Utu the sun. Inanna was given power over love, fertility and war, the forces that drive life and death alike. The pantheon was not chaotic but structured, mirroring the idea of kingship that defined Sumerian society. Just as a city had a ruler and council, so did the heavens. The divine order was a reflection of the human one, or perhaps the other way around. It was during this divine era that many of the tools of civilization were said to have been given to humanity. Writing, agriculture, architecture, and law were gifts from the gods, taught to humans so they could sustain the divine order on earth. Enki especially was associated with knowledge. He was said to have taught humans how to irrigate fields, how to make bricks, how to build canals. His wisdom flowed like water, endless, adaptable and necessary. To disobey him was to invite drought. To follow his guidance was to flourish. There's a fascinating balance in how these stories treat the descent of the gods. It wasn't purely benevolent. It was not about charity, but about management. Humanity was created to serve, but also to thrive. The gods didn't descend to enslave people. They descended to maintain balance. In their view, creation required caretakers, and humans were those caretakers, but service to the gods was not optional. Neglecting rituals or failing to maintain temples was seen as rebellion, and rebellion had consequences. The same beings who taught humanity could also punish it. The flood stories, the plagues, the famines, all were seen as divine corrections, reminders that order must not be forgotten. Over generations, these tales became the moral framework of an entire civilization. Every festival, every law, every act of governance was justified by divine descent. When kings spoke, they did so in the name of Enlil or Inanna. When priests issued judgments, they invoked Utu's light of truth. The line between god and ruler was blurred. In the mind of the people, the descendants of Anu had not vanished into myth. They were still present through the hands of kings and the voices of priests. The gods had simply shifted from walking the earth to walking within power itself. In the centuries that followed, neighbouring civilizations borrowed and reshaped these myths. The Akkadians and Babylonians kept the Anunnaki but added new faces, new hierarchies. The descent became not just an event but a recurring pattern, the idea that divine forces intervene whenever balance is lost. The Babylonians told of Marduk, who rose among the gods to bring order from chaos, just as the Anunnaki had done before. His story echoed the earlier Sumerian belief that power must descend from the heavens to legitimize the world below. For the Sumerians, though, the descent was not a tale of conquest but of cooperation. When the gods came down, they didn't simply rule, they interacted. They celebrated, argued, and sometimes even erred. Their mistakes shaped the earth as much as their wisdom did. Floods were signs of divine frustration. Fertile harvests were proof of favour. The gods' emotions were felt in the rhythm of the seasons. and because of that, the people developed rituals meant to soothe those emotions, songs to calm Enlil storms, offerings to keep Inanna's passions from turning to wrath, prayers to remind Enki to let his waters flow gently. One of the most intriguing aspects of these myths is how physical the gods are. Unlike the abstract deities of later religions, the Anunnaki had bodies, homes, and possessions. They ate, drank, slept, and travelled. Their palaces were described in detail, filled with gold and lapis lazuli. They rode chariots through the skies. When they descended, they did so in machines described as shining and loud. To modern readers, those descriptions sometimes sound eerily technological. Ancient alien theories build on this imagery, suggesting that these gods were in fact visitors from another world, using craft and tools that ancient humans could only describe as divine. Whether one believes that or not, the imagery remains powerful. The descent of the gods symbolized the crossing of worlds, the moment when heaven and earth met and something entirely new was born. But even divine presence fades with time. The myths tell that as the ages passed, the Anunnaki grew distant again. Their temples remained, but their voices grew quieter. Some say they returned to the heavens, others that they retreated beneath the earth into the Absu, Enki's realm of hidden waters. Humanity continued, now guided by memory and tradition rather than direct instruction. The gods had shown the way, and now the people were expected to walk it on their own. The rituals continued, the prayers persisted, but the world began to change. Kings replaced gods as visible rulers. The divine order turned into human governance. The descent had ended, but its consequences never did. When we look back on these stories today, they serve as both history and mirror. The Sumerians saw the descent of the gods as the foundation of everything, the origin of law, culture, and human identity. Whether they were speaking of literal beings or mythic archetypes, the idea remains the same. Civilization was not born from chaos alone. It was a gift, a responsibility passed down from those who came before, and that belief carried humanity through centuries of uncertainty. Even as new empires rose and fell, the notion that wisdom and order descend from the heavens stayed rooted in human thought. It appears again in the stories of divine kingship, in religions that speak of messengers or avatars, in philosophies that search for universal truth. Every time we imagine inspiration as something that comes down to us, we echo the Sumerian idea that knowledge itself is a descent from the divine. The Anunnaki's descent was more than a single moment in myth. It was a template for how humans understood progress and purpose. Creation wasn't a spontaneous act. It was instruction. Civilization wasn't self-made. It was inherited. The gods descended, but so too did knowledge, morality, and curiosity. The Sumerians didn't just tell stories about the heavens opening. They built their entire way of life around that opening, always looking upward, always listening for another arrival. And so, as the rivers of Mesopotamia continued to shift and the sands crept slowly over the ruins of Eridu and Uruk, the idea of the descent lived on, whispered in temple hymns, etched into clay, carried in the hearts of people who believed that once, long ago, the sky touched the earth, and everything that followed was a reflection of that moment. The gods had come down, but their story was far from finished. Humanity, now awake and aware, would carry their image forward, reshaping it, retelling it, building upon it, until the divine presence that once walked the plains of Sumer became a myth, and the myth became memory. Yet even now, when we gaze up at the night sky, the thought returns unbidden. Maybe the stars still remember. Maybe the sky people never truly left. The first stories about how humanity came to be were not written in ink or sung in rhyme. They were pressed into clay, piece by piece, by hands that still remembered the gods. The Sumerians didn't describe creation as a sudden miracle or a gift from nowhere. To them it was an act of necessity. The world had been built, the rivers carved, the heavens mapped, but there was still a gap in the order of things. The gods themselves, for all their strength, had grown weary. They were divine, but even divinity could tire of endless labour. They tilled the soil, shaped the mountains, filled the rivers, and maintained the rhythm of existence. And in time, that rhythm became too heavy to sustain. The younger gods, often called the Igigi, were said to have borne the brunt of that burden. They worked without rest, digging canals, carrying earth, tending to the creation their elders had set in motion. One by one, their patience began to fray. The tablets describe a moment when they gathered, their voices rising against their overseers, demanding relief. They had built and built, but the world's weight only grew, and so they rose in rebellion. The Anunnaki above them, those who had ruled since the heavens first opened, looked down on this unrest and saw that something had to change. They could not undo creation, nor could they return to the formless void. What they needed was a solution, a new kind of being to take up the labour of the gods. It was Enki who offered the answer. Among the divine family, he was the thinker, the mediator, the one who saw paths where others saw walls. He proposed that they fashion helpers, beings made of both divine and earthly material, strong enough to work, aware enough to obey, capable of carrying the tasks of the world. The idea was bold, even dangerous. To mix the essence of the gods with the dust of the earth was to blur the line between heaven and clay. But the balance of creation was faltering, and necessity often opens doors that caution would keep closed. So, the Anunnaki gathered in council. The decision was made, the tools prepared, and the materials chosen. They would shape the new beings from clay, taken from the banks of the sacred rivers, the same earth that had been moulded by the first floods of creation. But clay alone could not hold life. It needed spirit, vitality, something drawn from the gods themselves. Enki proposed that they use the blood of a divine being as the spark of consciousness. One god, chosen or volunteered, would be sacrificed, his essence mixed with the clay to create a bridge between worlds. It would be a trade, one life given to create many. The myths differ on which god gave that sacrifice. Some name Gestui, a deity of intelligence. Others leave him unnamed, a symbol rather than a figure. What mattered was the act itself, the merging of the divine with the earthly. The blood was poured into the clay, the mixture kneaded and shaped by divine hands. When it was done, they formed the first humans, fragile and soft, but filled with the essence of divinity. Enki spoke the words of awakening, and breath entered the new forms. The clay stirred, the eyes opened, and the first human stood upright, blinking in the new light of the world. It's a simple image, but it carries extraordinary weight. Humanity, in this telling, was not an accident or a lesser creation. It was a deliberate act, born from both compassion and practicality. The gods needed help, but they also recognized something sacred in what they made. The mixture of clay and blood symbolized the union of opposites, heaven and earth, permanence and fragility, thought and matter. Every human in that sense was a piece of both worlds, mortal in body, divine in spirit. It explained why people could build cities like gods but die like dust. The newly made humans were given tasks immediately. They tended the fields, maintained the canals, offered sacrifices, and sang praises. In return, the gods granted them the tools of civilization. The first skills, agriculture, masonry, weaving, and writing, were all said to come from divine instruction. To work was not punishment, but purpose. Labour itself became sacred. Each harvest, each brick laid, each hymn sung was an act of devotion, a way of fulfilling the balance established at creation. To the Sumerians, this wasn't a myth of servitude. It was a story of relationship. Humans worked for the gods, but the gods also depended on humans. It was mutual sustenance. The temples needed caretakers, the rituals needed voices. The divine world and the human world were two halves of the same whole. Still, not every god agreed on how much freedom this new creation should have. Enlil, as always, favoured order and obedience. Humanity, he believed, should remain in its place, loyal, disciplined and unquestioning. Enki, however, saw things differently. He had made them, and he saw in them more than just workers. He saw curiosity, creativity, the spark of divine reason. There are stories of him secretly teaching humans more than he was permitted to, how to read the patterns of stars, how to heal wounds, how to shape tools, how to question. In these tales, Enki becomes a protector of humanity, even when his compassion puts him at odds with the other gods. There's a certain irony in that tension. The gods had created humans to ease their own burdens, but in giving them divine essence, they had also given them the ability to dream, to question, to reach beyond their purpose. Creation, once begun, is rarely controlled. The humans began to multiply, their voices filling the air, their cities spreading. Their work pleased the gods, but their noise, their constant activity, their prayers, their singing, grew unbearable to some. Enlil, disturbed by their clamour, saw humanity not as partners but as disruptions. The tablets say he complained that their sound kept him from rest. The divine council gathered again, and Enlil proposed that something be done. At first, the gods tried to limit humanity quietly. Droughts came, famine followed, pestilence spread. Each time Enki intervened, teaching humans how to survive, how to purify water, how to store grain, how to heal sickness. When the divine assembly agreed to send a flood to cleanse the earth, Enki broke silence again. He could not speak openly, the oath of the gods bound him, but he whispered warnings to Ziusudra, a man of virtue and wisdom. The warning came not in words but in dreams, a murmur through reeds, the sound of water speaking to water. Enki instructed him to build a vessel, to gather his family, to take animals and seeds of life aboard. When the flood came, the world was drowned, but Ziusudra endured. When it ended, the gods relented and humanity began anew. That story, older than the one told in later scriptures, carries the same theme, the balance between authority and compassion, between divine order and human survival. Enlil's floods and Enki's rescues were two sides of the same cosmic argument, how much freedom creation deserves. And through it all, the humans remained, carrying forward the memory of their mixed birth, shaped from clay and animated by divine blood. The Sumerians didn't imagine their gods as flawless beings of pure goodness. The Anunnaki were complex, their motives layered. They could be cruel or kind, nurturing or indifferent, but in their complexity they were real to the people who worshipped them. The story of human creation was not simply a tale of origin. It was a mirror of life itself, a reminder that existence is always built from opposites, that every gift carries a cost and that every act of creation holds within it the seed of rebellion. The temples that rose across Mesopotamia echoed this duality. Inside their walls, priests offered daily rituals to maintain harmony between man and God. Incense smoke drifted upward like silent prayers. Offerings of food and drink were laid before the statues of deities, their eyes often laid with shining stone, unblinking, eternal. To the people, these rituals weren't superstition, they were communication. Each gesture kept the fragile balance intact. Each chant was an echo of that first breath that Enki had spoken into clay. The gods had given life, and humanity's task was to keep that life aligned with divine will. It's striking how matter-of-fact the ancient texts are about this process. They don't dwell on miracles or divine spectacle. They describe the act of creation almost like craftsmanship, measuring, moulding, mixing. The gods were artisans as much as rulers. They shaped the world the way a potter shapes clay, with precision and patience. Even the idea of using clay as the material for life carries a kind of practical symbolism. Clay was everywhere, humble but versatile. It could hold water, form vessels, become brick or tablet. It was the foundation of civilization. To make humanity from clay was to root our existence in the same material that built their world. And yet, within that simplicity lies something profound. By blending divine blood with earthly clay, the myth suggests that life is neither entirely spiritual nor entirely physical. It is a union, a compromise between the eternal and the temporary. That dual nature explains the contradictions of human experience, our creativity and our destructiveness, our longing for meaning and our fear of mortality. The Sumerians didn't need philosophy to understand those contradictions. They lived them every day, and their myths gave them form. There's another layer to this story, one that scholars still debate. In some versions, after the first humans were made, the gods realized they had created more than they intended. The humans were clever, resilient, and full of will. They began to question their place, to wonder why they laboured while the gods rested. In one passage, Enki remarks that his creation knows too much. It's a quiet warning, an acknowledgement of what happens when knowledge is shared too freely. Yet he does not undo his work. He seems to accept that once consciousness has begun, it cannot be contained. The gods had wanted servants, but they had birthed thinkers. Over time, that shift in perspective transformed the relationship between gods and men. Humanity was no longer seen purely as a creation of service, but as a reflection of the divine mind. The same spirit that moved the gods was present, though dimly, in human beings. That realization led to a new kind of reverence. Not just worship through offerings, but through imitation. To act wisely was to honour Enki. To rule justly was to echo Enlil. To love fiercely was to follow Inanna. The boundaries blurred further, and the stories began to explore not only the power of gods over humans, but the power of humans to mirror their creators. Every civilization that followed in Mesopotamia carried some version of this myth. The Akkadians retold it with new names. The Babylonians added layers of cosmic order. But the core remained the same, that life came from the union of heaven and earth, that we carry both the fragility of clay and the spark of divinity. It's an idea that outlasted the ziggurats and the temples, that slipped quietly into other religions and philosophies. Even now, the notion that humans are both matter and spirit, both body and soul, carries the echo of those first stories. Archaeologists have found tablets that describe the act of creation in sequences almost like instructions. One tablet from Nippur tells of how the gods mixed the heart of clay with the blood of the divine. Another describes the ritual words spoken over the mixture, words meant to give it breath. The detail is almost clinical, as if the process was remembered not just as legend, but as something that once felt real. These were not metaphors to the people who recorded them. They were recollections of what their ancestors had been told by priests who believed they were preserving sacred truth. When you read those lines today, there's a kind of humility in them. They don't present humanity as the centre of the universe, as later traditions would. Instead, they place us within it, necessary, purposeful, but small. We are workers in a vast design, born of need as much as of wonder. The gods made us not because they had to love, but because the world required hands, and yet, through that practical act, something miraculous happened. The breath that Enki gave didn't just animate bodies, it sparked thought. That was the real creation. Not life, but awareness. That awareness has never stopped reaching back toward the heavens that made it. Every generation since has tried to understand its own origin, to explain why we are both creators and destroyers, both mortal and eternal in imagination. The Sumerians offered one answer, because our essence is mixed. We carry the patience of earth and the restlessness of divinity. The gods gave us their labour and their curiosity, and that combination has never left us. In the quiet ruins of what was once Eridu, where reeds now whisper over ancient stones, the myth of clay, blood and breath still lingers. It speaks not of perfection, but of balance. The gods didn't create humanity to be flawless. They created us to continue their work, to shape, to build, to dream. And in doing so, they gave us the very thing they could not control, the ability to choose. The clay remembers, The blood remembers, the breath continues, and through that breath, the story of creation moves forward, carried by every generation that dares to ask how the heavens first touched the earth and what it meant to be made in that meeting. There was a time, the old tablets say, when the gods still walked among their creations without distance or anger. The world was young then, full of promise and balance, and the Anunnaki ruled side by side with the first generations of humankind. The rivers were steady, the harvests full, the skies kind. People built cities not from ambition but from gratitude, places of worship that shone like jewels in the dust. This was the age before the flood, the time when the boundary between heaven and earth had not yet hardened into silence. The people of Sumer called it the era of kingship from heaven, when divine order flowed directly into the world below, and every ruler was seen as a caretaker of that order rather than a master of it. It's difficult now to imagine what those people thought the world looked like then, before fear or pride began to corrode the bond between gods and mortals. Their records describe an age of symmetry, when everything had its proper place. The gods worked their will through nature, and humanity tended that design. There was no need for conquest because the earth gave freely, and no need for rebellion because purpose was clear. The first kings were not emperors but mediators. They ruled from cities like Eridu and Uruk, places that shimmered with trade, music and ritual. People believed their leaders carried fragments of divine blood, not metaphorically but literally. The Sumerian king list, that ancient record of rulers and reigns, begins not with men but with gods. It opens with a line as simple as it is haunting. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. That one sentence tells us everything about how the Sumerians saw their beginnings. To them, leadership was not invented. It was inherited from the gods who had first ruled the world. Kingship descended, not emerged. The first kings were bridges between heaven and earth, responsible for maintaining harmony. Their authority wasn't measured in conquest, but in how well they preserved balance. The Anunnaki watched over them, guiding their decisions, rewarding wisdom, punishing greed. It was a partnership, and for a time it worked. The world flourished. In this age of peace, the temples were alive. Priests sang at dawn, their voices carrying through the courtyards as incense rose into the pale sky. Farmers tilled the soil in rhythm with the chants, believing that each furrow turned in time with sacred words ensured fertility. The gods, they said, could hear the vibration of devotion itself. When storms came, they were not feared as punishments but understood as the breath of Enlil passing through the land. When the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates rose to flood the fields, it was Enki cleansing and renewing the soil. Every event from the blooming of reeds to the setting of the sun was part of a divine rhythm. There's a quiet elegance in how the Sumerians describe this era. They didn't write about perfection in the way later traditions did. Their golden age was not free from hardship. It was balanced by wisdom. The people worked, but they understood why. They worshipped, but not out of fear. Their relationship with the gods was not submission, but respect, an acknowledgement of interdependence. Humanity needed the divine, and the divine needed humanity. The offerings given in temples weren't just symbolic, they were sustenance. The gods fed on devotion, on the continuity of the rituals that kept their presence anchored to the earth. Archaeological traces of this early prosperity still linger in the soil of southern Iraq. The remains of canals, intricate beyond what should have been possible at the time, show how deeply those people understood the balance between water and land. They channeled the rivers, cultivated the fields, and built their homes in harmony with nature rather than against it. In their minds, the act of engineering was not separate from faith. When they carved channels to guide the floods, they were following divine blueprints. The gods had taught them how, and to ignore that teaching would have been an offence. Even now, the faint outlines of those ancient waterways can be seen from above, marks of a civilization that once believed it was literally sustaining the design of the universe. In this early age, art and language blossomed. the Sumerians began carving stories of their gods onto tablets, recording hymns, prayers, and histories. They were not writing for entertainment, but to preserve the sacred memory of how the world worked when it was still whole. Many of these texts read like reminders, as if written by a people afraid of forgetting what the gods had once given them. They describe how the Anunnaki bestowed the gifts of civilization, the arts of measurement, the laws of trade, the secrets of healing and construction. Each skill was tied to a specific deity, a recognition that knowledge itself was divine. The closer one reads these old stories, the clearer it becomes that the Golden Age was never meant to last forever. Harmony in the Sumerian worldview was something fragile, something that required constant care. And like all living systems, it eventually began to falter. The myths don't blame humans alone. They describe tensions among the gods, rivalries that echo the same patterns later seen in the mortal realm. Enlil, stern and absolute, grew impatient with the noise of humankind. The people multiplied, their songs and prayers filling the air day and night. What had once been harmony began to sound like chaos. The gods' rest was disturbed, their patience tested. It was in this growing unease that the seeds of the flood were sown. But before that, the texts speak of a final flourishing, a last brilliant stretch of prosperity before the deluge erased almost everything. The rulers of this time were said to have lived impossibly long lives, reigning for hundreds, even thousands of years. To the modern reader, those numbers sound symbolic, exaggerations meant to emphasize greatness. But to the Sumerians, they were literal, proof that these early kings were more than mortal. They were descended from the gods, and their extended lifespans were signs of that divine inheritance. Eridu, the first city, stood as the heart of this world. Its temple to Enki, built over generations, was said to shine with sacred metals. Its walls were adorned with scenes of creation, rivers flowing from the gods' hands, fish leaping beneath them, trees blossoming in endless renewal. People came from distant lands to offer gifts, to seek blessings, to learn the secrets of irrigation and writing. In those days, knowledge was not hidden, but shared. The wisdom of the gods flowed freely because the world was still in alignment. It was a time when divine generosity outweighed divine judgment. Yet even in this harmony, there were signs of imbalance. Cities began to compete for the gods' favour. Each wanted to be the centre of divine attention, the chosen place of kingship. The temples grew larger, their rituals more elaborate, their priests more powerful. Offerings that had once been acts of gratitude became displays of wealth. The people still believed, but belief started to shift from reverence to ambition. Power began to replace purpose. The divine order, once clear and cooperative, started to bend under the weight of pride. The myths suggest that even the gods felt this change. Enki, ever watchful, sensed the unrest. Enlil, seeing the growing noise and arrogance below, grew harsher. Inanna, drawn by passion and competition, began to favour certain cities over others, stirring rivalries that mirrored her own celestial wars. The balance that had defined the Golden Age was slipping, not through malice, but through the slow, inevitable accumulation of desire. Humanity, born from clay and blood, had inherited the restlessness of both. In this final phase of peace, the Sumerians imagined the gods still descending to attend festivals, to accept offerings in person. The divine statues that stood in the temples were not just representations, but believed to house the living essence of the gods themselves. When priests anointed the figures with oil, dressed them in fresh robes and laid food before them, they were tending to real presences. The gods were there, watching, eating, blessing. It was a relationship of immediacy and intimacy, but even this began to fade. The rituals grew longer, the gods more distant. The voices that had once been heard in dreams became harder to reach. The divine light that had filled the temples began to dim, slowly and quietly, as if retreating toward the heavens. The stories say that the gods withdrew because the world had become too loud. Humanity, thriving and multiplying, no longer listened. The priests still performed the rites, but the sincerity had thinned. The offerings became transactions. The balance between giving and receiving, between devotion and gratitude, was breaking. The Anunnaki, once so close, began to speak among themselves about the fate of creation. Some argued for patience, others for cleansing. The world, they said, had become heavy again, too burdened by its own noise. The same reason that had once led to humanity's creation now began to justify its destruction. Before that reckoning came, though, there was still beauty. The Golden Age did not end with war or famine, but with abundance. People thrived, unaware that their prosperity was nearing its end. Their songs of praise filled the air. Their temples overflowed with offerings. They built towers higher, dug canals wider, reached further across the land. It must have seemed, to those who lived then, that this harmony would last forever. But myths, like seasons, always move in cycles. Every spring is followed by harvest, every harvest by decline. The gods who had given life were preparing to reshape it once again. In later interpretations, especially among the Babylonians, this age became the symbol of innocence, a time when gods and humans were united, when wisdom flowed like water, and when the world was unscarred. But even then, it was never described as perfect. The Sumerians were too pragmatic for that. They knew that balance always required maintenance, that creation was never finished. Theirs was not a paradise lost, but a harmony interrupted. The memory of that era endured long after the flood came and went. When later generations rebuilt the cities, they spoke of those earlier days with reverence. The myths were not nostalgia, they were reminders. They warned that every civilization carries within it the seeds of its own undoing, that the line between devotion and arrogance is always thin. The Golden Age was not a dream, but a lesson, one that humanity keeps forgetting and rediscovering in every age. The priest who wrote those tablets might have felt the echo of that lesson as they worked. Their words, etched in clay, speak not only of gods and kings, but of longing, the desire to reconnect with what was once whole. Each generation that told the story added its own interpretation, its own way of explaining why the gods withdrew and what it would take for them to return. Some said humility, others wisdom, others the rebuilding of the sacred temples. But beneath every explanation was the same unspoken truth. The world had been closest to perfection, not when it was silent or simple, but when it was in balance, when gods and humans shared the same purpose. Even now, that image of the Golden Age endures. It lingers in the way people imagine beginnings, a time of clarity, of closeness to the divine, of effortless harmony. Whether it ever truly existed doesn't matter as much as what it represents. For the Sumerians, it was a reminder of what can be achieved when humanity remembers its origin, not as conquerors, not as servants, but as participants in something larger. The flood would come soon enough, sweeping away the world that had forgotten its place. But before that, there was a moment, brief and radiant, when everything was aligned, when gods ruled the earth not through thunder or judgment, but through presence. And perhaps somewhere deep in the collective memory of civilization, that presence still stirs, not as nostalgia for the past, but as an instinct that whispers that harmony, once known, can always be rebuilt. The balance that had once defined the world began to tremble. The rivers that had fed the fields grew unpredictable, sometimes generous, sometimes cruel. The air felt different, heavier, as though it carried the weight of unspoken judgment. The people still prayed, still brought their offerings to the temples, but the connection between heaven and earth had changed. It was no longer a shared rhythm, it had become a negotiation. The gods listened, but not all of them were pleased. Enlil, whose word carried the authority of heaven, watched the world below with growing frustration. Humanity had multiplied beyond control. The noise of their cities, their songs, their quarrels, rose into the skies day and night. What had once been devotion now sounded like clamour. The calm of the divine realms was gone, replaced by the endless hum of mortal life. Enlil saw not vitality, but chaos. He saw a world drifting away from order, and he believed it was time to restore silence. He called the council of the gods. The great assembly gathered, Anu from the heavens, Enki from the deep waters, Ninhursag, Inanna, and others who governed the cycles of existence. Enlil spoke of the noise of humankind, of their arrogance and their growing disregard for divine boundaries. He argued that the world had become too heavy, that the balance could no longer hold. The gods debated, as they always did, but in the end a grim decision was made. The world would be cleansed. The age of the first humans would end in water. Enki, silent through most of the council, listened as the decree was sealed. He did not agree, but he also knew that defying a divine consensus was perilous. The laws of heaven bound even the gods. Yet as the meeting ended and the others withdrew to their realms, Enki lingered. In his heart there was no peace. He had helped create humanity. He had moulded their forms and given them life. To destroy them all for their noise seemed not justice but cruelty. But how could he intervene without breaking his oath? The tablets describe his dilemma with surprising tenderness. Enki does not stand as a rebel in open defiance, but as a father torn between duty and compassion. His loyalty to the divine order clashes with his loyalty to life itself. The decree of the flood cannot be spoken against, yet silence feels like betrayal. And so, he finds another way. Far below, in a city by the river, there lived a man named Ziusudra. He was not a king in the grand sense, nor a hero of conquest, but a man known for his wisdom and his honesty. He served his people quietly, tending to the rituals, preserving the old ways. It was said that he listened to the whispers of the gods in dreams, that his heart was still open to the voice of the divine when others had grown deaf. Enki chose him not for power or status, but for understanding. Unable to speak the forbidden words directly, Enki turned to the language of dreams. In one version of the story, he speaks through the walls of Ziusudra's reed house. The walls themselves become his messengers. The sound of water moves through them like a voice. "Reed wall," he says, "hear my words. Reed wall, pay attention to my instruction. Through that channel the warning is given, the flood is coming, the world will drown. But one man must build a vessel and preserve life." Ziusudra wakes from his dream, shaken but clear. He knows what he has heard is not madness. The air feels charged, as if the elements themselves are listening. Without hesitation, he begins the work. The people around him do not understand. They watch as he gathers wood, measures beams, seals planks with pitch. Some laugh, others whisper that he has lost his mind. But Ziusudra continues. His hands move with purpose, guided by faith in the unseen. He builds a vessel large enough to hold his family, his animals, and the seeds of the world. The days that follow are tense. The sky grows darker, clouds gathering in unnatural density. Winds shift, restless and strange. In the temples, priests continue their offerings, but the gods do not answer. The air smells of rain, though no drop falls. It is the silence before the storm, the long breath before the world changes. When the first lightning splits the horizon, it feels less like weather and more like judgment. The flood begins not as a storm but as an unravelling. The rivers rise, the ground trembles, and the rain begins, first softly, then with fury. The heavens open as if torn apart. Waters pour from the sky and surge from beneath the earth. The boundaries that once kept the elements in balance dissolve. The flood does not come in waves, but in a single, unending rush. The sound is deafening. The temples collapse, the fields vanish. The cries of the people are swallowed by the roar. Inside the vessel, Ziusudra listens as the world he knew disappears. He has no way of knowing if the gods will relent or if this is truly the end. The air grows heavy and still. Outside, only water, endless, shifting, merciless. Days pass without light. The rain continues until even the mountains are gone. The gods themselves grow uneasy. Enlil's fury cools as he watches the devastation. The silence he wanted has returned, but it is absolute, empty, lifeless. In some of the oldest verses, the gods are described as mourning. Even Enlil, the instigator, regrets what has been done. The destruction of humankind feels too complete. They had wanted correction, not extinction. Ninhursag, the mother goddess, weeps for her children. Inanna's temples are gone, her worshippers lost. The flood has cleansed not only noise but devotion. The divine world feels hollow, without the echo of human praise. Enki, who had warned Ziusudra, watches from the waters below. He knows that life still remains inside the vessel, that his defiance has preserved the seed of renewal. When the time is right, he sends a wind to calm the waves and a light to pierce the clouds. The flood begins to subside. The vessel drifts until it grounds itself on a mountain peak. Ziusudra opens the hatch and looks out over a world remade. The silence now is different. It is not divine judgment, but possibility. He steps onto the wet earth, his feet sinking into the mud that was once city and field. Around him stretches emptiness. No voices, no walls, no temples, just the remains of creation, waiting to begin again. The air smells clean, sharp, alive. Ziusudra offers a sacrifice as Enki instructed. He builds a small altar and burns reeds, cedar and myrtle. The smoke rises in gentle spirals reaching the sky. The scent reaches the gods, and it moves them. The tablets say the gods gathered like flies around the offering, hungry for the smell of devotion after so long without it. Enlil arrives last, still angry, still proud, until he sees the vessel and the man standing beside it. He knows what Enki has done. He knows the decree has been broken. His wrath rises again, but it fades as quickly as it comes. The sight of the offering softens him. The world, he realizes, can begin anew. Enki steps forward and speaks openly now. He does not deny his actions. He argues that destruction without renewal serves no purpose. The flood was meant to restore balance, not to erase existence. Humanity, he insists, has learned humility. The world can be remade, wiser than before. After some time, Enlil concedes. He blesses Ziusudra and his descendants, decreeing that never again will a flood destroy all life. The gods retreat to their realms, the sky clears, and the rivers return to their courses. The story of Ziusudra survives in many forms, as Atrahasis in Akkadian texts, as Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and as Noah in the later scriptures of the West. Each retelling changes the names but preserves the same heartbeat. Divine wrath, human endurance, and renewal. It is not just a story of punishment. It is a meditation on responsibility, on what happens when creation forgets its balance, and how mercy can still emerge from destruction. For the Sumerians, the flood was both history and metaphor. The physical evidence of catastrophic floods across Mesopotamia gave the tale credibility, but its meaning was deeper. The flood was the reset, the reminder that even divine creation must be renewed. It wasn't simply about water. It was about cycles, growth, excess, collapse, rebirth. Just as the rivers flooded the fields to bring fertility, the great deluge washed away corruption to allow life to begin again. Ziusudra, in this sense, became the bridge between two worlds. He was the last of the old humanity and the first of the new. The gods granted him immortality, allowing him to dwell in a distant paradise where the sun rises, beyond the reach of mortals. His survival was not just a reward, but a preservation of memory. He carried the knowledge of what had come before, the understanding of both divine justice and divine compassion. He remembered the sound of the flood, the silence after, the promise that followed. In later centuries his name faded, replaced by others in foreign tongues, but the shape of his story endured. Every civilization that rose after Sumer carried some version of that memory. that humanity had once been spared, that a covenant existed between earth and sky. The Anunnaki's decision to let life continue became the foundation for the idea that divine order is not only judgment but mercy. The flood was never meant to end the story, only to rewrite it. When archaeologists uncovered the ancient city of Shurupak, long believed to be Ziusudra's home, they found a thick layer of river silt dividing one era of habitation from another. It was not proof of myth, but it was a whisper of truth, evidence that something had indeed happened, something remembered so vividly it became sacred narrative. Perhaps there was a great flood. Perhaps it reshaped the memory of the people so deeply that they came to see it not as disaster, but as conversation with the gods. In the centuries that followed, new cities rose on the same soil. The temples were rebuilt, the rituals resumed. Humanity began again, carrying forward the lessons etched into clay, that balance must be tended, that even the mightiest civilizations can drown if they forget their place in the order of things. The priest told the story of Ziusudra not to frighten but to remind. When the rains came heavy, when the rivers swelled, they would say it was the earth remembering. When the waters receded, they would say it was the gods forgiving. The flood had wiped away the golden age, but it had also given birth to a new kind of wisdom. Humanity was no longer the child of gods who walked beside them, but the custodian of their memory. The world had changed, but the breath that Enki had given still moved through it. Life continued, not because the gods willed it, but because one man had listened. In the quiet after the deluge, Ziusudra's descendants began to build again. They laid the first stones of the new cities, tracing the old lines of the rivers. They remembered the stories, the warnings, the blessings, and in their hearts there remained the faint echo of a promise, that the gods had once walked among them, that they had destroyed and restored, and that life, however fragile, had endured. That endurance became the heart of Sumerian belief. The flood was not the end of divine contact, but the beginning of distance. The gods no longer lived among men, but their presence remained in the rituals, the symbols, the cycles of nature. Every sunrise was Enki's light reflected in the waters. Every harvest was Ninhursag's renewal. Every storm was Enlil's reminder. The world had been remade, but the story was far from over. When we read those ancient lines today, there's a sense of both loss and gratitude. The flood story is not just about destruction, but about continuity. The idea that even when everything is washed away, memory survives. Ziusudra remembered, and because he remembered, so did we. His story travelled across centuries, reshaped by new tongues and new beliefs, but its essence remained. It was not the gods who preserved humanity, it was humanity that preserved the gods. The waters eventually withdrew, but their shadow lingered in every myth that followed. And somewhere in that lingering silence, in the distance between the first world and the one that followed, the gods watched as humanity took its next uncertain steps, no longer children but heirs to both creation and consequence. When the floodwaters finally withdrew and the land began to dry, the world was quiet in a way it hadn't been for ages. The rivers returned to their courses, the fields were uncovered, and the air carried the smell of new soil. Life began again, small and careful. Seeds were planted, fires were lit. The first voices that rose after the silence spoke softly, as if afraid the gods were still listening too closely. Humanity had survived, but it was not the same humanity that had existed before. Something had changed in the rhythm of the world. The gods had stepped back, their presence no longer immediate, their voices more distant. And in that space between heaven and earth, something new emerged. Leadership, the bridge that would replace divine presence with human guidance. The Sumerians said that after the flood, kingship descended once more from heaven. Those words appear at the beginning of their king lists, written carefully into clay. After the flood had swept over, and kingship had descended from heaven, kingship was in Kish. To them, It wasn't a figure of speech. It was the literal continuation of the cosmic order. Power did not rise from the ground, it fell from the sky. Kings were not chosen by people. They were appointed by the gods to maintain balance, to keep the fragile peace between creation and chaos. Before the flood, the world had known divine rule, gods walking among men, shaping cities, setting laws. But now that connection was gone. The gods had withdrawn to their distant realms. The air was quieter. The prayers reached further but received fewer replies. Humanity was still bound to the heavens, but through symbol rather than presence. The first kings were meant to embody that connection, part mortal, part divine messenger. They ruled not for themselves, but on behalf of the cosmic will. The city of Kish became the centre of this new order. Its walls were built upon the silt left behind by the flood, a literal foundation of renewal. People gathered there from scattered settlements seeking structure, protection, and hope. The priests read omens, the elders debated, and finally a leader was chosen. Etana, the man they would later call the Shepherd King. His name appears near the top of the lists, marked as the first ruler of the post-flood world. The legends say he was appointed not merely by the people, but by the gods themselves. The voice of Anu was said to have blessed him, the strength of Enlil to have settled upon his shoulders. Etana's story, preserved in fragments, is not one of conquest or wealth, but of search. He longed for something beyond the reach of mortals, the plant of birth, a symbol of continuity, the power to ensure his line would not die out. In his quest he was aided by an eagle who carried him up into the heavens, rising higher and higher through the layers of the sky. From that height Etana could see the curve of the world, the rivers like silver veins, the cities like grains of sand. It was not a tale of ambition, but of understanding. Kingship in this earliest form was not about domination. It was about ascent, about bridging the distance between earth and heaven, not with arrogance, but with purpose. The idea of kingship as a divine gift shaped everything that followed. The Sumerians didn't see their rulers as independent powers. They were caretakers, entrusted with the divine blueprint of civilization. A king's duty was to keep order, to ensure the rituals were maintained, to make offerings on behalf of his people. His authority came with obligation. If he ruled unjustly, if he ignored the gods or mistreated the land, disaster followed. Floods returned, harvests failed, enemies rose, balance had to be preserved. This sense of sacred responsibility was woven into the daily life of Sumer. The palace and the temple were not separate realms. They were extensions of the same authority. The king was expected to consult the priests to interpret the will of the gods before making any great decision. War, construction, trade, all were framed as acts done with divine approval. Even when new dynasties rose and empires expanded, that belief remained unshaken. A ruler without the favour of the gods was not a ruler at all. But kingship was more than religious duty. It was the structure that allowed humanity to rebuild after the flood. The cities that emerged from the mud were not random clusters of homes, but carefully planned communities. Canals were dug, walls raised, temples erected at the centre of each settlement. These acts required coordination, organisation, and trust, the kind of order that only kingship could provide. The gift from heaven was not only symbolic, it was practical. It was the framework of civilization itself. The early kings were often called shepherds, a word that carried deep meaning in Sumerian thought. A shepherd was responsible for his flock, guiding, protecting, and sustaining it. It implied gentleness, but also vigilance. A good shepherd didn't exploit, he served. This image shaped how kings were expected to rule, as caretakers of life, accountable to both people and gods. In inscriptions, rulers would often describe themselves not as conquerors, but as faithful shepherds, chosen to maintain the divine pasture that was the world. The stories tell that Etana's reign brought stability, but after him came others whose ambitions began to stretch the limits of divine patience. Kish was followed by other cities, Uruk, Awan and more. each claiming that kingship had descended upon them in turn. Each new ruler insisted that the gods had favoured their city, their people, their rule. The divine gift, once pure, began to fragment as human pride grew. Uruk, the city of Inanna, rose as the next great centre of power. Its most famous ruler was Gilgamesh, the semi-divine king whose story would echo across millennia. 2/3 god and 1/3 man, Gilgamesh embodied the Sumerian vision of kingship's duality, mortal in body, divine in purpose. His tale, inscribed in countless tablets, shows both the greatness and the peril of that heritage. He sought immortality, not content with earthly power. He built walls so grand that they were said to rival the heavens, temples that gleamed like stars. Under his rule, Uruk flourished, but the story also warns of the danger of forgetting humility. When Gilgamesh became consumed by his desire to defy death, the gods intervened to remind him of his limits. His quest led him to Utnapishtim, the immortal survivor of the flood, the same figure known earlier as Ziusudra. The meeting between them is one of the most poignant in all ancient writing. Utnapishtim tells the restless king that immortality is not the right of mortals, not even of kings. The gift of life is not eternal youth but remembrance. The true purpose of kingship, he says, is to preserve order and memory, not to escape mortality. This exchange defines the Sumerian understanding of rule. Authority was not about becoming a god, but about serving their design. To rule well was to align oneself with divine rhythm. To rule poorly was to fall out of harmony and invite chaos. The flood had already proven what happens when imbalance grows too great. Every king knew that lesson, and every generation had to relearn it. The rituals that surrounded kingship reflected this philosophy. When a new ruler took the throne, he underwent purification rites meant to symbolize the descent of divine favor. The priest would pour sacred water over his head, representing Enki's blessing. He would be clothed in robes dyed the color of the heavens, adorned with a scepter symbolizing authority and a ring symbolizing unity. These ceremonies were not political theatre but sacred reenactments of cosmic order, the moment when heaven once again touched earth. Every year, during the Akitu festival, the renewal of kingship was celebrated. The ruler would enter the temple, kneel before the statue of the god and declare his humility. The high priest would then strip him of his regalia, slap him, and make him recite confessions. Only after this symbolic humiliation could the king be reinstated as the divine representative on earth. The ritual reminded everyone, king and citizen alike, that power was borrowed, not owned. The gods could give it, and the gods could take it away. The Sumerians recorded their kings in lists that mixed history and myth, tracing the line of rule back to the gods themselves. They didn't separate the supernatural from the political. Each reign, whether it lasted a year or a century, was part of a sacred continuum. The king list wasn't just a record, it was a declaration of cosmic legitimacy. It reminded the people that their world still moved according to divine order, even when the gods no longer walked among them. Over time, kingship became the defining feature of Mesopotamian civilization. The Anunnaki, once direct rulers, had become distant, but their authority lived on in the institution of kingship. The rulers of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria all traced their power back to that same celestial descent. Even when empires shifted and languages changed, the idea persisted. Kings were not merely men. They were the chosen hands of the gods, entrusted with the responsibility of maintaining the world's fragile balance. But the Sumerians also understood the danger in that belief. The higher the throne, the greater the fall. Power, when misused, became its own form of chaos. The gods had withdrawn from the earth once because of imbalance. They could do so again. In the myths, kings who forgot humility, who built without gratitude, who ruled through fear rather than wisdom, met swift ends. Their cities fell, their temples burned, their names erased. To lose divine favour was to lose everything. And yet, The idea of kingship endured precisely because it gave meaning to life after the flood. It replaced divine presence with divine purpose. The people could no longer hear the voices of the gods, but they could see their will reflected in the structure of society, in the rhythm of governance, in the rituals that linked the throne to the heavens. Kingship was the thread that connected the mortal world to the divine tapestry. It's hard not to see something deeply human in this. The Sumerians were trying to rebuild meaning after catastrophe, to make sense of a world where the gods had once walked and then vanished. Kingship became their answer, a way to hold on to the memory of divine order while learning to govern themselves. It wasn't about control, it was about continuity. Through kingship, the story of creation could keep unfolding, even without direct intervention from above. As generations passed, the idea evolved but never disappeared. Later rulers claimed descent not only from the gods, but from the heroes who had carried their will, from Etana, from Gilgamesh, from those who had bridged the gap between heaven and earth. The kings built ziggurats, towering structures meant to reach the sky, symbols of the connection they maintained. The higher they built, the closer they believed they came to the divine. Each step of those mountains of brick was an echo of the descent and ascent that defined the relationship between gods and men. And through it all, the people continued to believe that kingship was not human ambition, but divine trust. The flood had wiped away the arrogance of the First Age, but it had also planted the seed of renewal, the understanding that leadership was sacred service. A king's glory was not his wealth or his conquests, but his ability to sustain harmony. When he succeeded, the fields were fertile, the rivers calm, the gods content. When he failed, even the skies turned against him. The Sumerians never forgot that kingship, like the flood, came from heaven. Both were forces of creation and destruction, balance and correction. To receive the gift was to accept its burden. And in that burden lay the fragile heartbeat of civilization itself, the understanding that every ruler, every city, every age stands only so long as it remembers where its power truly comes from. The flood had cleansed the earth. Kingship rebuilt it. And as the sun rose each morning over the rivers of Sumer, people looked to their temples and palaces and saw, reflected in their rulers, the lingering light of the gods who had once ruled the earth themselves. The world that rose from the flood had been rebuilt on fragile ground. For generations the cities of Sumer thrived, spreading across the plains between the Tigris and Euphrates like constellations reflected on earth. Canals branched out like veins, carrying life to the fields. Temples rose again, ziggurats climbing toward the sky as if trying to reclaim the closeness humanity had once felt to the gods. Each city glimmered with its own rhythm, its own divine patron, its own claim to being the true heart of creation. But the story of Sumer was never one of permanence. Its brilliance came not from stillness, but from motion, from transformation, from inheritance. The gods who had once ruled directly through their chosen cities would see their names carried far beyond these river valleys, reshaped by new tongues and reborn in new empires. The land that gave birth to civilization was not content to remain unchanged. The same rivers that fed Sumer also divided it. Each city-state was both neighbour and rival, bound by faith and yet competing for favour. The gods, who were once family, seemed to mirror the politics of their worshippers. Enlil's authority in Nippur was respected, but Uruk had Inanna's power, and Eridu still whispered of Enki's wisdom. The divine court was reflected in the human one, and the human ambitions reflected back into the divine. Over time, what had once been unity began to splinter into cycles of dominance and decline. The city of Kish, once the first to hold kingship after the flood, eventually gave way to Uruk. Then Ur, Lagash and others took turns at the centre. Each city rose with divine blessing and fell when that blessing was withdrawn. The priests explained each rise and fall as a reflection of cosmic will. Kingship, they said, had simply moved. It was never lost, only relocated. In that way, the gods seemed to rotate their favour, teaching through both abundance and hardship. For centuries, this rhythm sustained the people. They accepted change as part of the divine pattern. But with each shift, the cities grew more complex, their rulers more ambitious, their armies larger. Trade stretched beyond the southern plains into the northern lands and across deserts to distant shores. Bronze weapons gleamed in the sun, and the cities that once competed through ritual now competed through war. It was during these turbulent times that a new language began to mingle with the old. The voice of Akkad, a people from the north who would soon reshape everything. The Akkadians shared the same gods but spoke their names differently. They worshipped Enlil as Enlil, Inanna as Ishtar, Utu as Shamash. Their language was new, but their reverence was ancient. When they came into contact with Sumer, they didn't destroy its faith, they absorbed it. The gods of the south became their own, their myths translated and reinterpreted. It was through them that the stories of the Anunnaki began to travel beyond the borders of Sumer, carried into the empires that followed. Among the Akkadians rose a figure whose name still echoes across history, Sargon of Akkad. His origins were humble, said to be the child of a priestess who placed him in a basket and set him adrift upon a river. The story would be retold thousands of years later, reshaped into other names and other scriptures, but it began here, among these rivers. Sargon's rise from obscurity to power was seen as proof of divine favour. He united the cities under one rule, creating the first true empire in recorded history. But even as his armies expanded and his statues filled the temples, the old belief persisted that kingship still descended from heaven. Sargon ruled with the blessing of Ishtar, the Akkadian name for Inanna, whose fierce favour could raise or destroy kingdoms. Under Sargon, the boundaries of Sumer dissolved. The gods of the cities were woven together into a larger pantheon. Enlil remained the high authority, Enki the source of wisdom, but Ishtar rose in prominence, her image appearing in cities far beyond Uruk. She was both the goddess of love and of war, a paradox that suited an age of empire. Soldiers carried her symbols into battle. Merchants invoked her name for prosperity. The Anunnaki were no longer local guardians. They had become the divine infrastructure of a vast civilization. Yet empire brought with it a new kind of instability. The old Sumerian order had relied on balance between city and temple, between king and priest. The Akkadian model tilted that balance toward the throne. The ruler was no longer just a servant of the gods, but their living embodiment. This shift was subtle at first, but it marked the beginning of a long transformation. The slow elevation of kings from intermediaries to near divine beings in their own right. The gods were still revered, but their voices became harder to distinguish from those of their chosen rulers. The distance between heaven and earth grew smaller again, but this time through power rather than faith. The Akkadian Empire shone brilliantly and burned quickly. After Sargon's death, his descendants struggled to hold the vast territory together. Rebellions flared, famine struck, and invaders pressed from the east. The empire fractured, and in the chaos that followed, people turned once again to the gods for explanation. The inscriptions from that period are filled with laments, prayers to Enlil, Ninhursag and Ishtar, asking why the divine favour had turned away. The answer, as always, was that balance had been lost. Pride had overshadowed humility. The flood of ambition had come not from water this time, but from men. When the dust settled, Sumerian culture re-emerged, resilient as ever. The cities rebuilt themselves, reclaiming their independence and their faith. It was during this time that the third dynasty of Ur rose to prominence, with King Ur-Nammu at its head. His reign brought stability and innovation, but perhaps his greatest legacy was the codification of law. The Code of Ur-Nammu, carved into clay centuries before Hammurabi's more famous version, laid down rules for justice, property, and behaviour. It was presented not as a human invention, but as divine instruction, laws granted by the gods to ensure harmony. Through law, kingship was transformed again, no longer just a matter of divine appointment, but of moral duty. Earth thrived, and for a while, it seemed as if the world had returned to the peace of the Golden Age. The temples glowed with offerings, trade flourished, and art reached new heights. But like all things, the balance did not last. Invasions came from the north and east, new peoples, new languages, new gods. The Sumerian cities fell one by one, and the last echoes of their language began to fade. But their influence did not die. It moved, quietly, into the heart of the next great power that would rise from the same soil, Babylon. Babylon began as a modest settlement, one of many along the Euphrates. Its early kings were local rulers, its temples small compared to the grandeur of Ur or Nippur. But over time, it grew. Trade routes converged there. The canals brought wealth and population. And above all, its priests began to reinterpret the ancient stories, giving them new shape and purpose. The myths of Sumer became the myths of Babylon, but with one crucial change. At the centre of this new order stood Marduk. Marduk was a god of late arrival, little known in the early pantheon. But as Babylon rose, so did he. In the great creation epic known as the Enuma Elish, written in the Babylonian period, Marduk emerges as the champion of the gods. He defeats Tiamat, the dragon of chaos, and from her divided body fashions the heavens and the earth. The story is both familiar and transformed. Where Sumer had spoken of cooperative creation, of divine councils and shared power, Babylon's myth introduced hierarchy and conflict. Creation now came through victory, through conquest of chaos. It mirrored the structure of empire. One ruler at the top, order imposed from above. Yet even in this reimagining, the bones of the older stories remained. The Anunnaki still appeared as a divine assembly, their names preserved, their roles redefined. In the Enuma Elish, they served Marduk, granting him supreme authority after his triumph. The old gods had not vanished, they had been reorganized, their stories folded into the new narrative. Babylon did not erase Sumer. It absorbed it, reshaped it, and carried it forward. This transformation marked a turning point in how humanity saw its relationship with the divine. In Sumer, the gods had been near, imperfect, emotional, present in daily life. In Babylon they became more distant, more ordered, more formal. The rituals grew grander, the theology more structured. The ziggurats reached higher, their steps symbolic ladders between heaven and earth. The priests' chants echoed not just in devotion, but in administration. The temple had become both house of worship and centre of power. Religion and governance were now indistinguishable. The Babylonians inherited the Sumerian reverence for cosmic order, but they expressed it in new ways. The concept of me, the divine laws that governed existence, became the foundation for their understanding of destiny. The gods no longer acted on whims, but through these immutable decrees. Even the gods themselves were subject to them. This idea would echo through later civilizations, shaping how people understood fate, law, and justice. The legacy of Sumer had transformed from myth into philosophy. As Babylon's influence grew, so too did its reach. The stories of the Anunnaki travelled with merchants and scribes, crossing borders and centuries. In the hands of new cultures, they changed again. The Assyrians adopted them, carving their own versions into stone reliefs, winged beings with human faces, holding pine cones and sacred buckets, symbols of purification. In their art, the Anunnaki were not ethereal gods, but tangible figures, guardians standing at the gates of palaces, protectors of kings. The ancient myth had become iconography, its power transmuted into image. And yet, beneath all these layers of reinterpretation, the essence of the old belief remained intact. The world, they still believed, was born from the meeting of heaven and earth. The gods had shaped humanity not once, but continuously, through floods, laws, and leadership. The relationship between divine and mortal was not a single event, but an ongoing conversation. Babylon may have changed the tone, but the dialogue persisted. The priests of Babylon understood the value of continuity. They kept the old Sumerian texts, copying them onto fresh tablets, preserving the names of gods whose temples no longer stood. In their schools, young scribes learned both languages, Sumerian for sacred ritual, Akkadian for administration. To them, Sumer was not forgotten but revered as the foundation of all knowledge. The past was not something to leave behind, but something to build upon. When Hammurabi, Babylon's most famous king, carved his laws into stone, he did so in the same spirit as Ur-Nammu before him. His code begins not with human reason, but with divine command. It declares that the gods appointed him to cause justice to prevail, to destroy the wicked, to protect the weak. Even as empires changed, the idea of kingship as divine trust endured. The gods might change names, but their will remained. Through Babylon, the influence of Sumer spread far beyond Mesopotamia. The flood story travelled westward, transformed but recognizable. The tales of creation, of gods forming humanity from clay, of divine councils debating the fate of the world, all of it found new life in the myths of neighbouring peoples. The old stories became the foundation of civilization itself, their echoes shaping the world's understanding of where it had come from. In the end, Sumer vanished not through conquest but through absorption. Its language fell silent, its cities turned to dust, but its ideas lived on in every culture that followed. Babylon was not its replacement, but its continuation, a new chapter in the same long narrative that began when the first gods looked down upon the plains and decided to shape them into something more. The journey from Sumer to Babylon was not a fall from grace, nor a loss of purity. It was evolution, the natural progression of a world that never stops interpreting its origins. The gods of the old world had taught humanity to build, to write, to remember. And remember they did, even as the names changed, even as the temples rose and fell. The Anunnaki were still there, watching from the stone walls, listening through the chants, present in every act of creation. By the time Babylon reached its height, the memory of Sumer had already become legend. Yet the rivers still followed their ancient paths, the stars still traced their patterns above the plains, and the people still looked upward when they prayed. In that sense, nothing had truly ended. The world had simply found a new way to speak the same truth. That everything built by human hands is, in some way, an echo of the divine that once shaped the earth. And from those echoes, the story would continue, carried forward into new ages, under new names, but always tracing back to the cradle where it all began. By the time Babylon's temples glowed with the fires of evening offerings and its priests whispered prayers into the night air, the memory of the earliest gods had already begun to drift into mystery. The Anunnaki were still invoked, their names etched into tablets, their images carved into stone. But the more time passed, the more their stories became blurred between myth and speculation. What had once been a matter of faith, gods who walked among men, who built cities and shaped rivers, began to take on the weight of forgotten knowledge. The people still remembered their names, but they no longer remembered their faces. The gods who had once ruled the earth were now distant, their origins hidden behind layers of language, translation, and time. And somewhere within that growing distance a new word began to appear, Nibiru. It wasn't born in the temples of Sumer or Babylon as a name of a place or a god. In the oldest texts it was something subtler, something astronomical. The term first appears in Babylonian star catalogues, where it is used to describe a crossing point, a marker of transition, a star or planet that passed between the realms of the gods. The word itself meant the crossing, or the point of transition. It was a term for movement, not a place. But over time, as with so many other pieces of ancient language, it began to evolve. What was once an astronomical symbol became something larger, something that scholars, mystics, and dreamers would later turn into a story of origins beyond the earth. The Babylonians, like their Sumerian predecessors, saw the heavens as a reflection of the divine order. Every star, every planet, every visible light in the sky had meaning. The gods moved through the heavens as surely as they once walked the earth. The sky was their second temple, a vast record written in fire instead of clay. To read the stars was to listen to the gods. The movements of Jupiter, Mars and Venus were not random paths of light but messages, patterns that mirrored events below. Among these celestial bodies, one stood apart, Marduk's star, associated with Nibiru. In the Enuma Elish, the great Babylonian creation epic, Nibiru appears as the celestial form of Marduk, the supreme deity of Babylon. After defeating Tiamat, the primordial chaos, Marduk is described as setting the stars in their courses and naming Nibiru as his own station in the sky, the crossing point through which the gods and planets pass. Nibiru shall be his name, the text says. He shall control the passage, they shall all stand before him. In that single line, the word that had once meant movement became the symbol of rule, the marker of divine control over the heavens. To the priests of Babylon, this was theology woven into astronomy. The sky was a reflection of political order, one central authority, one god reigning supreme, his planet or star presiding over all others. But for later generations, especially those who looked back on these texts without the same understanding of their symbolic language, Nibiru began to take on a more literal meaning. The idea that there was a wandering world, a hidden planet associated with the gods, began to grow. It was as if the ancient stories themselves had left a door open, inviting new interpretations. When modern scholars first translated the Enuma Elish in the 19th century, they were astonished by how sophisticated the Babylonian cosmology was. The precision of their astronomical record suggested knowledge that seemed advanced beyond its time. They tracked the motions of the planets, predicted eclipses, and understood celestial cycles with remarkable accuracy. Among those discoveries, the mention of Nibiru stood out, not just as a star or a mathematical point, but as something mysterious, undefined. Some scholars saw it as Jupiter, others as Mercury, others as a variable marker depending on context. But outside the realm of academic study, the name took on a life of its own. In the 20th century, long after the last temple to Marduk had crumbled, Nibiru was reborn, not in cuneiform but in speculation. It was reinterpreted as a lost planet, a world from which the Anunnaki themselves were said to have come. Writers began to suggest that the gods of Sumer were not divine metaphors, but visitors from another world, advanced beings who had come to Earth in the distant past, bringing knowledge, technology, and life itself. In this retelling, Nibiru was not a symbol of celestial authority, but a physical place, the home world of the gods. It's easy to see how the idea took root. The ancient texts were filled with stories of the gods descending from the sky, teaching humanity, building cities and shaping creation with tools and methods beyond human comprehension. The descriptions of their vessels, their luminous appearances, their power over the elements, all could be read as myth or as misunderstood memory. The flood stories spoke of destruction from above. The creation stories described humanity being engineered from clay and divine essence. To those looking for a bridge between ancient myth and modern science, Nibiru offered a key. But before that later interpretation can be understood, it's worth returning to how the Babylonians themselves viewed it. For them, Nibiru was not the home of gods but their path, a point of crossing between realms. It symbolized transition, the movement of divine will through space and time. In ritual texts, it represented balance, the place where order was established after chaos. When Marduk was said to take his station at Nibiru, it meant that the cosmic system had been stabilized, that creation was no longer in flux. The world had been fixed in its proper orbits, just as kingship had been fixed on Earth. Still, there's something compelling about how the word survived. The Babylonians wrote about Nibiru as an object in the heavens, visible, powerful, moving in ways that commanded respect. They saw in it the reflection of divine authority, a constant reminder that what happened above shaped what happened below. For them, the universe was not silent. It was a living structure filled with will and intention. Every planet was a messenger. Every star was a sign. And somewhere within that vast cosmic order, Nibiru marked the point where heaven's plans touched the world of men. When viewed through that ancient lens, the idea of Nibiru as a lost world makes sense in a symbolic way. It was lost not because it vanished, but because humanity forgot how to read the sky as the ancients once did. The Sumerians and Babylonians didn't separate science from spirituality. To them, astronomy was theology in motion. The disappearance of that understanding, the reduction of the sky from a realm of meaning to a field of measurement, could itself be seen as a kind of loss. Nibiru became hidden not in space but in time. The modern fascination with Nibiru as a literal planet reflects something that has always lingered in human imagination, the need to reconnect with our origins. Whether one sees the Anunnaki as divine beings or ancient visitors, the story points to the same yearning, the belief that humanity is not alone, that our beginnings were guided by something greater, something that once walked among us and might return. That idea, in one form or another, has persisted since the first people looked up at the night sky and saw the reflection of their gods. If the Sumerians could stand beneath the stars today, they might not recognize the names we've given them, but they would recognize the impulse. To them, the stars were living history, records of creation still unfolding. They didn't believe the heavens were distant. They believed they were part of a shared existence, a mirrored world where divine forces moved in patterns that humans could learn to read. The gods, in that worldview, were not separate entities but expressions of cosmic order. To know the stars was to know the gods. To forget them was to lose one's place in the story. In that sense, Nibiru's mythic transformation from crossing point to lost world is a mirror of our own evolution. The ancients saw meaning in movement. The modern mind seeks meaning in location. We look for coordinates where they looked for connections. But perhaps in their language both are the same. A crossing is not just a point in space. It's a meeting of paths, a convergence of worlds. To say that Nibiru was where the gods passed between heaven and earth may not have meant that they came from there physically, but that it was the place, or the moment, where their presence became manifest. The priests who recorded the celestial movements of Nibiru likely understood it in practical terms as well. The Babylonians were master astronomers, and their records of planetary motion were astonishingly precise. Nibiru may have referred to the position of Jupiter during certain periods, marking the time when it crossed the ecliptic, the path of the sun and planets through the sky. To them, Jupiter was the star of Marduk, the sign of kingship and stability. When it reached the point of crossing, it symbolized divine renewal, the restoration of order after chaos. Every year, when the star of Marduk appeared in the east, the priests would declare the renewal of creation. They would recite the Enuma Elish, retelling the story of how Marduk conquered Tiamat and set the cosmos in its place. This was not a mere festival. It was a reenactment of the act of creation itself. The world, they believed, required continual maintenance, not through tools and machines, but through remembrance and ritual. Each time the story was told, the cosmos was reaffirmed. Nibiru was not a distant planet. It was the moment of alignment, when the divine and the mortal once again moved in harmony. But for those who would later reinterpret the texts, that symbolism became literalized. The idea of a returning celestial body, an object that passed near the Earth on a vast elongated orbit, captured the imagination of writers centuries later. They imagined Nibiru not as a concept but as a place, a lost world beyond the edge of sight, home to the very gods who had shaped humanity. The Sumerian creation story, in which the gods mixed their essence with the clay of the earth to create man, was reimagined as an act of genetic engineering by visitors from the stars. The myths of divine descent were read as memories of arrival. The connection between these modern interpretations and the ancient texts is tenuous, but the resonance is undeniable. Whether read as symbolism or speculation, the story carries the same pulse, the idea that knowledge, power, and life itself came from beyond. The ancients expressed that in the language of gods and heavens, the modern world translates it into planets and science. In both, there is the same longing, the belief that we are the product of something greater than ourselves. It's easy to forget, reading the old texts, how deeply intertwined the cosmic and the human were in those early civilizations. The Babylonians didn't study the stars to understand distance, they studied them to understand destiny. The heavens were a clock, a map, a reflection of the divine mind. Nibiru, in their eyes, wasn't just a star among stars. It was the symbol of movement, of balance, of the point where cycles began anew. It represented the ongoing conversation between chaos and order, between creation and destruction, the same forces that had defined the flood, the rise of kingship and the shaping of the world. Even as Babylon rose and fell, the name endured. Astronomers and priests continued to record its position, its passing, its meaning. And though the temples eventually fell silent and the language faded, the symbol of Nibiru, the crossing, remained embedded in the human mind. It resurfaced in new forms, in new myths, each time humanity reached a point of uncertainty and looked upward for meaning. In the end, the lost world of Nibiru may not be a world at all, but an idea, a bridge between the seen and the unseen, between what the ancients believed and what we continue to search for. It reminds us that knowledge and faith have always shared the same sky, and that even when we forget the old words, the stars still trace the same patterns, the same stories, waiting for us to read them again. And in that endless crossing between what was once divine and what has become human, the story of the Anunnaki continues, not as a relic of the past, but as a reminder that the heavens were never truly separate from the earth. Long after the last ziggurat had lost its luster under centuries of wind and dust, the stories of the Anunnaki continued to move in new directions, carried into lands that had never seen the great rivers of Sumer. The names changed, the languages shifted, but the essence of the old tales endured. The people who came later didn't think they were retelling Sumerian myths. They thought they were remembering their own. The gods who once ruled the earth had left behind an echo so deep it found new voices everywhere it travelled. In one corner of that vast inheritance, the story took on a new form, in words carved and copied far from the cradle of civilization. Those who once called themselves the children of Anu became known by another name, the Watchers. The ancient texts that mention them come from a different tradition, one that would eventually give rise to the early Hebrew writings. In these later accounts, the Watchers are described as divine beings who came down from heaven to live among men. They are not exactly the same as the Anunnaki, yet they carry unmistakable traces of them. The stories share the same structure: heavenly beings descending, mingling with humanity, teaching forbidden knowledge, and facing divine judgment for disrupting the natural order. The Sumerian gods became teachers of civilization. The Watchers became the transgressors of heaven. Between them lies the same haunting theme, that contact between the divine and the mortal always comes with a cost. In the Book of Enoch, one of the oldest and most detailed accounts of the Watchers, their descent is told with a kind of tragic inevitability. 200 of them, led by figures named Semyaza and Azazel, look upon the daughters of men and find them beautiful. They swear an oath together, fearing that none will act unless all do. The pact binds them, and they descend to earth on Mount Hermon, crossing the boundary between realms. Once there, they take human wives and teach humanity things the heavens had kept secret: the art of weapon making, of adornment, of enchantment, of reading the stars. Civilization, in other words, flourishes, but knowledge, once given, cannot be contained. It's difficult to read that story without hearing the faint echo of older Mesopotamian myths, the descent of divine beings, the teaching of forbidden arts, the union between gods and mortals, these are not isolated ideas. They're patterns, recurring under different names and in different ages. The Sumerians had told of the Anunnaki bringing the me, the sacred laws of civilization, to humankind. The Babylonians had written of gods shaping mortals from divine blood to bear their burdens. And now, in this later retelling, the same event is cast in shadow, no longer a gift but a transgression. The teachers of knowledge become the corrupters of innocence. The gods become the fallen. The children born of these unions were called the nephilim, a word whose meaning has been debated for centuries. In its most direct translation, it suggests the fallen ones, or those who cause others to fall. Some traditions describe them as giants, beings of immense strength and stature, who filled the earth with violence. Others see them as kings and heroes, men of renown who dominated early human history. Whatever their nature, they stood as proof of the forbidden union between heaven and earth, living reminders that boundaries had been crossed. In the old stories, their power became their undoing. The Nephilim, born from divine blood, were said to have ruled with arrogance, turning their strength toward conquest. The world they created was one of excess, of pride, of endless noise. In the language of Sumer, it would have sounded familiar. The same hubris that had once angered Enlil and brought the flood. In the Hebrew version, the pattern repeats: the corruption of the earth by the children of the gods, the sorrow of heaven, and the cleansing waters that followed. The flood of Noah, like that of Ziusudra, comes as divine correction. It's as if every culture along the ancient rivers remembered the same event but gave it a different face. The parallels are too deep to ignore. The Anunnaki and the Watchers share the same duality: creators and destroyers, teachers and transgressors, divine yet flawed. In both traditions they bring wisdom, but also imbalance. They blur the line between mortal and immortal. The humans who receive their gifts rise in power but fall in virtue. And in both stories the gods, or the heavens, respond with flood and silence. The world must begin again, purified of the noise of its own creation. But the story of the Watchers goes further. It doesn't end with the flood or with their destruction. According to the Book of Enoch, the Watchers who descended were punished. Bound in darkness beneath the earth, they awaited judgment. Their leader, Semyaza, was cast down. Azazel, blamed for teaching humans how to make weapons and jewellery, was buried beneath the desert, his name cursed. Yet even in punishment their presence lingers. The text says that the spirits of their offspring, the Nephilim who perished in the flood, remained on earth as wandering forces, restless, hungry, unable to return to heaven or die as mortals. Later generations would call them demons, the shades of the mighty ones who once ruled the world. It's tempting to read all of this as moral allegory, but it's also something deeper, a memory of an age when humans felt that divine beings had once walked among them. In Sumer, that presence was a gift. In Enoch's world, it was a warning. But the structure of belief, the memory of a world shaped by those from above, remained constant. The shift from reverence to caution mirrors humanity's own growth, from acceptance of divine rule to fear of its consequences. What had once been harmony between gods and men became a fracture that could never be repaired. There are scholars who suggest that the story of the Watchers was a reinterpretation of much older Mesopotamian material, filtered through centuries of retelling. The word Anunnaki may have softened into Elohim, the general Hebrew term for gods or divine beings. The heavenly descent that once brought civilization may have become the fall that brought sin. In that light, the Watchers can be seen as the shadow of the Anunnaki, their reflection in a world that had begun to see divinity not as guidance, but as danger. And yet, even within the Hebrew texts, the tone is not entirely condemnation. The Watchers, though punished, are also mourned. The Book of Enoch describes Enoch himself, the scribe of heaven, interceding on their behalf. He is sent to deliver their petitions before the throne of the Most High, pleading for mercy. The response he receives is unyielding. You were in heaven, but the mysteries of heaven you did not keep. You have corrupted yourselves with women, and you have taught them sorcery and enchantments. Still, the tone of the text carries sorrow more than rage. The Watchers are not monsters. They are beings who loved, who desired, who shared knowledge they believed would help. Their tragedy lies not in malice but in misunderstanding. The Nephilim, their offspring, become symbols of that same misunderstanding. In some ancient traditions, they are remembered not as villains but as the builders of the early world, the ones who raised the megalithic structures, who shaped the stones of forgotten ages. Their strength and size were remembered not only as physical might but as remnants of divine heritage. They were the link between humanity and the gods, proof that the two worlds had once mingled. In the oldest layers of myth, their downfall is not because of inherent evil, but because their very existence defied balance. They were living contradictions, neither divine nor mortal, destined to belong fully to neither realm. The image of the Watchers gazing down from heaven, choosing to descend, has haunted human imagination ever since. It's a story that appears in countless variations. Angels, gods, demigods, beings of light or flame, always watching, always crossing boundaries. To the ancients, it was both comfort and caution. The heavens were not indifferent. They were attentive. But attention could become interference, and interference could bring ruin. In the landscape of myth, the Watchers and the Anunnaki occupy the same space, the bridge between heaven and earth. The difference lies in how humanity chose to remember them. For the Sumerians, they were necessary. Without them, the world could not function. For later traditions, they were reminders of what happens when the sacred mingles too freely with the human. The stories became mirrors of human nature itself. Curiosity, desire, ambition, and the longing to understand what lies beyond. As time went on, the figure of the Watcher evolved again. In later Jewish and Christian writings, some were redeemed, others transformed into angels who guarded the cosmos, watching not out of rebellion but duty. The name Watcher came to mean both guardian and transgressor, depending on which side of heaven one looked from. The ambiguity was never resolved because it didn't need to be. The Watchers embodied a truth that ran deeper than morality, that knowledge and temptation are inseparable, that enlightenment always carries risk. Modern readers often see in these stories traces of something older, a lost age of contact between humanity and higher beings. Whether one interprets that as divine communion or ancient visitation, the underlying feeling is the same, that we are the descendants of an encounter, shaped by a relationship that once existed between earth and sky. The stories of the Watchers and the Nephilim keep that sense alive, even if their details have changed. They are reminders that the boundary between the human and the divine was once porous, and that memory still runs through our blood. In the ruins of Mesopotamia, among the broken tablets and fallen walls, archaeologists have found inscriptions that speak of gods, teaching men the secrets of the heavens, the same act for which the Watchers were condemned. The parallel is almost perfect. The Sumerians saw it as divine generosity. The later world saw it as forbidden knowledge. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps every gift from the heavens carries the potential to bless or to destroy, depending on how it is used. And so the story of the Nephilim and the Watchers stands as another chapter in the long history of the Anunnaki. The same figures seen from a different angle, their light refracted through the beliefs of new civilizations. Their descent, their union, their punishment, all are part of the same pattern that began when the first gods looked down at the earth and decided to shape it in their image. It is a story not of good or evil, but of consequence. Even now their names linger in quiet corners of human imagination. The Watchers became the eyes in the heavens, the silent guardians or fallen teachers. The Nephilim became the archetype of lost greatness, the memory of a race that once walked tall and vanished beneath the weight of divine correction. And behind them, always, remains the echo of the first creators, the Anunnaki, whose legacy runs like a thread through every tale humanity has ever told about the boundary between heaven and earth. The story never truly ends, because it was never meant to. Every retelling is another crossing, another Nibiru, another point where the paths of gods and men meet and diverge again. The flood recedes, the kings rise, the stars shift, but the watchers remain, looking down, remembered, forgotten, and remembered again. For thousands of years, people told stories about the gods descending from the heavens, walking among mortals, teaching them how to build, how to measure, how to rule. The earliest clay tablets called them the Anunnaki. Later scrolls named them the Watchers, or the Sons of God, or simply the ones who came before. Their presence stretched across continents and centuries, surviving in myth long after their temples fell. But in more recent times, the question began to shift. What if these stories were not allegories or religious metaphors? What if they were memories? Imperfect, half-forgotten accounts of real beings who had come from beyond our world. It was in the mid-20th century that this idea began to take shape in the modern mind, but its roots go much deeper. Long before it became known as the ancient astronaut theory, there were explorers, historians, and archaeologists who found themselves staring at ruins that defied explanation. Structures too precise for the tools of their supposed builders, stones cut and placed with a level of accuracy that modern engineers struggled to replicate. Legends from every corner of the earth describing the same image, sky beings who descended in fire, light, or thunder, who brought knowledge, language, and order. It was a pattern too consistent to ignore. The Sumerians were the first civilization known to have written about beings who came from the sky, and gave them civilization itself. To them the gods were not invisible. They were tangible, active presences who arrived in shining craft, wearing garments that glittered, carrying tools that hummed with energy. Their texts describe the gods descending from the heavens in their glory, their chariots roaring like storms. These are the first recorded images of what later generations would interpret as divine visitation. But read through a modern lens, they sound eerily familiar, like technological encounters described in the language of myth. In one Sumerian text, Enki, the god of wisdom, is said to have sailed across the sky in a shining boat that emitted fire. In another, the gods ascend in their chambers of wind and depart from the earth. The Akkadian word used, shedu, can mean spirit, but also vehicle, container, or chamber. The ancient scribes did not have words for machines. When they saw something they couldn't explain, they described it with the vocabulary they had. Divine, fiery, winged, radiant. To a world without engines or metal crafts, such visions could only be the movements of gods. Over time, these descriptions spread. The Egyptians carved scenes of their gods arriving from the stars, holding rods and discs that radiated power. The Dogon people of West Africa told of visitors from Sirius who descended to teach them astronomy. The Mayans wrote of the gods descending in pillars of light. The Greeks spoke of Apollo's chariot of fire and Hermes' winged vehicle. Across the world, separated by oceans and centuries, the same image appears again and again, not metaphor but memory. When modern archaeologists began uncovering the ruins of Mesopotamia, they found more than temples and tablets. They found blueprints. The ziggurats, those towering step pyramid structures, were not random monuments. They were built as stairways to the heavens, perfectly aligned with celestial bodies. The gods, the text said, descended upon their summits. These were not places of worship alone. They were landing points, platforms, gateways between earth and sky. The Sumerians called them Ikur, meaning mountain house, the home of the gods. But unlike natural mountains, these were built with precision, their levels rising in exact proportion, each layer representing a realm between heaven and earth. The deeper scholars studied, the more they realized how advanced Sumerian knowledge truly was. They knew the planets of the solar system, even those invisible to the naked eye. They depicted a sun-centered system with accuracy thousands of years before Copernicus. On some cylinder seals, the arrangement of planets around the Sun matches the modern order almost perfectly, including one additional planet beyond Neptune, shown large and distinct. To them, this was not speculation. It was information handed down by their gods, the Anunnaki. The ancient astronaut hypothesis suggests that these beings were not supernatural at all, but travellers from another world, advanced entities who came to Earth in the distant past and were remembered as gods. The word Anunnaki itself means those who came down from the heavens. It's a description, not a title. According to the Sumerian texts, their leader, Anu, ruled from the heavens, while Enki and Enlil oversaw operations on Earth. Their purpose, as the tablets describe, was practical: to establish order, to extract resources, and to build civilization. Humanity, in their view, was part of that project, a hybrid creation designed to assist in the work of maintaining the Earth. To the Sumerians, this was not mythology. It was history. Their king lists record the reigns of divine rulers stretching back tens of thousands of years. Modern historians treat these numbers as symbolic, but the Sumerians believed them literally. They wrote that before the flood, the gods themselves ruled the earth directly. Afterward, kingship descended again, but in human form. It's a timeline of transition, from divine governance to human imitation. The same pattern appears in nearly every early civilization. A golden age ruled by gods, followed by decline, followed by kings who claim divine descent. If the ancient texts are read not as allegory but as testimony, a different picture begins to form. The Anunnaki, the Nephilim, the Watchers, all may be echoes of the same beings, remembered through different languages and filtered through time. The stories of their descent, their instruction, and their departure are not mythic creation tales but accounts of contact, moments when human and non-human intelligence met. The question, of course, is why they came. The Sumerian records hint at a purpose that sounds eerily material. Some of the earliest tablets describe the gods working the land, extracting metals, digging canals, and commanding labour from the newly created humans. One text, known as the Atrahasis Epic, explicitly states that humans were made because the gods bore the work and suffered the toil. The Igigi, the younger gods, had rebelled against their labour, and so Enki proposed creating a new race, workers fashioned from clay and divine essence. That act of creation, in this interpretation, was not purely spiritual. It was technical. It was genetic engineering expressed through sacred language. The mixing of divine blood with earthly material reads, in modern terms, like an account of hybridization. The Sumerian use of the word blood often referred to the life force or the essence, not necessarily blood in the physical sense, but something taken from the gods themselves and transferred into humans. The clay symbolized the material of Earth, the raw biological substrate. To blend the two was to merge alien and terrestrial life into one form, humanity. Those who support the ancient astronaut interpretation argue that this perspective fits the pattern. The gods, or visitors, arrived on Earth for a reason: resource extraction, exploration, or survival. They created humanity as an intelligent labour force capable of sustaining their work. The myth of creation was humanity's way of remembering its own engineered origin. The flood, in turn, became the record of a global reset, a planetary event, whether natural or intentional, that wiped out the first experiment and began another. Critics of this theory see it as romantic speculation, a modern myth built upon misunderstanding. But even those who reject the idea acknowledge the mystery of the ancient texts. The precision of Sumerian astronomy, the sudden emergence of agriculture, writing, mathematics and law, all within a short span of history, remains one of the great puzzles of civilization. The Sumerians themselves never claimed they invented these things. They said, repeatedly and without hesitation, that they were given to them by the gods. Every ancient culture seems to share the same confession. The Egyptians said that Thoth brought writing and knowledge from the stars. The Maya credited Kukulkan, the feathered serpent who descended from the heavens. The Inca spoke of Viracocha, the bearded god who emerged from the sea to teach humanity. The Greeks remembered Prometheus, who stole fire, knowledge he had from the gods and gave it to man. Each culture describes an external source of wisdom, a moment of transmission from something beyond. When seen together, these stories form a global pattern that defies coincidence. It's not that one civilization copied another, it's that all seem to recall a shared event. Different names, different symbols, same structure. The descent, the gift, the mixing, the departure, the promise to return. It's as if the human story itself began not with invention, but with contact. Some researchers have even pointed to physical evidence that might hint at such encounters. Depictions of beings wearing what look like helmets, carrying devices that resemble tools or instruments. In Assyrian reliefs, winged figures hold objects shaped like modern wristwatches. Others carry what appear to be pouches or containers. The so-called Bag of the Gods appears not only in Mesopotamia, but in carvings from Mesoamerica and the Andes. Identical shapes, carried by figures associated with creation. No one knows what they represent, but their consistency across distant cultures is hard to explain. In the oldest temples, carvings of stars, suns, and flying discs appear, alongside images of gods interacting with humans. The Sumerians used the symbol of a winged disc to represent divine presence. The same image would later appear in Egypt as the solar bark of Ra, in Persia as the Faravahar, and in later ages as the halo of saints. Each new culture inherited the same visual language, but its meaning slipped further from memory. What began as depiction became devotion. The idea that the gods were travellers from the heavens doesn't diminish their power, it reframes it. To the ancient mind, the distinction between technology and magic didn't exist. A being who could fly, control light, heal disease, and alter life itself would be divine by every measure. The titles of godhood were not exaggerations, they were acknowledgements of power. If those visitors truly existed, they would have been gods not because they demanded worship, but because they embodied abilities far beyond comprehension. As millennia passed, the stories became religion, and religion became history. The Anunnaki, the Watchers, the Nephilim, all faded into the language of myth. The world forgot the faces of its teachers, yet the memory of their return never vanished. Every age has carried some version of that expectation, that the gods will come back, that the sky will open once more, that humanity will see the same descent that its ancestors witnessed. Whether that return is literal or symbolic doesn't matter as much as what it reveals about the human condition, that we still look upward, still search for the source of the spark that began civilization. What the ancient astronaut theory ultimately touches is not just archaeology or science, but psychology, the deep collective sense that our story began in partnership with something greater. The ancients expressed it through reverence, calling it divine. Modern thinkers approach it through curiosity, calling it extraterrestrial. Both point toward the same truth, that the question of our origin remains open. Perhaps that is why the myths endure. Not because we need to believe in gods, but because we need to remember that knowledge has a source. Whether that source lies in the stars or in the imagination of early humanity, it continues to shape the way we see ourselves, as a species that was taught, awakened, and left to continue the work begun by its mysterious benefactors. When the Sumerians carved their tablets, they did not think they were creating myth. They were recording memory of the ones who came from above, who gave them the tools of civilization, and who promised before they departed that one day they would return. And so the question remains, echoing through every age that inherits their words. Were the gods of old divine beings of spirit and symbol, or were they travellers from the stars, the astronauts of antiquity? Either way, the story endures, written not only on tablets of clay, but in the collective memory of a world that has never stopped looking to the sky for its origins. Every civilization eventually looks backward and asks where its stories end and its history begins. The Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Hebrews, the Egyptians, the Greeks, all of them told their beginnings as truth. They didn't think of myth and history as separate. For them, the past was not a straight line of years, it was a circle of memory. The gods who ruled the world, the floods that reshaped it, the kings who carried divine blood, these were not symbols. They were recollections of how things truly had been. The modern mind, so focused on measurement and evidence, has inherited those stories like fragments of an old dream. And now, thousands of years later, we find ourselves trying to translate what those dreams really meant. When archaeologists began digging into the plains of Mesopotamia in the 19th century, they expected to find traces of a forgotten people. What they found instead were the foundations of everything: writing, mathematics, architecture, astronomy, law, all born in a place that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The first cities, the first temples, the first systems of timekeeping, all fully formed. There was no long gradual climb from primitive to civilized that textbooks once imagined. Civilization appeared suddenly, as if someone had turned on a light. The Sumerians themselves said as much. They wrote that their knowledge came from the gods, who descended from the heavens and taught them how to order the world. To them, the birth of history was divine intervention. To us, it's a mystery that refuses to fit cleanly into timelines. The more that was uncovered, the more the line between myth and fact blurred. The great flood that destroyed the world, long considered a moral fable, turned out to echo geological reality. Layers of sediment across Mesopotamia show evidence of massive flooding events that would have devastated early settlements. The names of kings once dismissed as legendary, Gilgamesh, Enlil, Etana, began appearing on inscriptions and artifacts. Cities mentioned in Sumerian epics were found beneath layers of soil exactly where the text said they would be. Myth, it seemed, was not invention, but memory. It was history written in another language. Yet there's another side to this discovery. As the clay tablets were translated, scholars noticed that the earliest records didn't read like mythology at all. They read like chronicles, lists of reigns, accounts of trade, inventories of temples and grain. Only later do the divine elements appear. The stories of creation, of the flood, of the gods walking among men. It's as if the boundary between ordinary record and sacred story didn't exist for the people who wrote them. They didn't draw a line between what was human and what was divine, because in their minds there was no separation. The gods were part of daily life. To speak of them was not to speak of belief but of experience. That unity between belief and memory is what modern interpretation struggles to recover. When we read their words, we divide them. Religion on one side, history on the other. But the Sumerians didn't think that way. Their gods were not symbols of natural forces or psychological archetypes. They were tangible beings who lived, acted, and ruled. The Anunnaki were administrators of the cosmos, each with duties, hierarchies, and domains. Their temples were not places of worship in the modern sense. They were houses of management, where divine order was sustained through ritual and record. Every act, from harvesting crops to reciting hymns, was part of maintaining balance between heaven and earth. Over the centuries, as civilizations rose and fell, those stories spread and evolved. The Babylonians inherited them, the Assyrians reinterpreted them, the Hebrews transformed them, and the Greeks echoed them in new language. The myths we call separate, creation, flood, descent, kingship, are all versions of the same sequence of events, told by different voices. Each retelling simplifies and moralizes the story a little more, but the structure remains. There was a time when gods ruled on earth, when humans and divine beings coexisted. Then came the corruption, the flood, the reset, and the rise of mortal kings under divine oversight. It's not one story, it's the spine of human history. When the Sumerians described their gods, they didn't portray them as abstractions of good or evil. They were complex, contradictory, emotional. Enki could be compassionate and cunning. Enlil could be just and merciless in the same breath. Inanna could nurture and destroy. Their power was never questioned, but their morality was constantly debated. This complexity feels deeply human, and perhaps that's the point. The gods were reflections of the human condition, or perhaps humanity was the reflection of theirs. The line runs both ways. Modern readers tend to divide the world into natural and supernatural science and faith. The ancient mind didn't recognize that division. To them, the world was one system. The movement of a star and the birth of a child were both part of the same design. The flood that erased cities was both natural disaster and divine decision. They saw no contradiction between physical reality and spiritual causation. Everything that happened in the world was an expression of will, sometimes of gods, sometimes of men, but always part of a single continuum. That worldview is what makes the myths so enduring. They don't just explain events, they explain meaning. The flood wasn't just water, it was renewal. The descent of the gods wasn't just visitation, it was instruction. The creation of humanity wasn't an accident of nature, it was a statement about purpose. These stories endure because they give shape to questions that science still can't answer. Why civilization began so suddenly, why humans seem wired for symbolic thought, why we alone among species remember. The question of memory is what bridges myth and history. The earliest written words humanity ever carved were not trade records but names of gods. The first attempts at writing were not about ownership or wealth, but about remembrance. It's as if civilization itself began as an act of preservation, an effort to hold on to something that was already slipping away. The Sumerians wrote because they feared forgetting, and what they feared forgetting most were the ones who came before. When archaeologists uncovered the city of Eridu, one of the oldest in Sumer, they found layer upon layer of temples built on top of one another, 18 in total, each replacing the last. At the lowest level, the earliest structure was small, humble, but clearly sacred. The people who rebuilt it again and again over thousands of years were not expanding out of convenience. They were preserving something. The temple was dedicated to Enki, the god who gave humanity knowledge. To rebuild his house over and over was an act of continuity, a way of anchoring memory to the earth. The structure became both a monument and a timeline, each layer a reminder that the divine past was not gone but buried just beneath the surface. This interplay between past and present defined all Mesopotamian civilization. Every new city carried the bones of the old within it. The myths were not nostalgia, they were instruction. They told the people how to live within a universe that was both physical and sacred. When the Babylonians replaced the Sumerians, they didn't reject their stories. They reorganized them, giving Marduk the throne once held by Enlil, reshaping the pantheon to match the new political reality. The myths evolved not because belief faded, but because humanity's understanding of its relationship with the divine changed. Each new era redefined what it meant for heaven and earth to meet. By the time Babylon fell to the Persians, the old gods had already begun to drift into allegory. Zoroastrianism introduced a dualistic worldview, light versus darkness, order versus chaos. The divine became moralized, divided into good and evil in a way the older gods never were. The unity between creation and destruction fractured. Myth began to split away from history, and faith began to demand purity instead of balance. The gods who had once walked openly among men receded into heaven, and the stories of their presence became sacred secrets, reserved for priests, scribes, and initiates. The memory of contact was preserved, but its meaning changed. This separation between the literal and the symbolic is where much of our modern confusion comes from. When we read the old texts, we try to decide whether they are factual or fictional, but for the people who wrote them, those words were both. The ancient worldview did not draw the same boundaries we do. Myth was the language of experience, and history was the record of its repetition. To ask whether the Anunnaki were real is to impose a modern question on an ancient context. They were real in the only way reality existed to those who recorded it, through impact, through continuity, through memory. It's also worth remembering that history, even now, is written with belief. The difference between a myth and a chronicle is often just a few generations of forgetting. The Sumerian records that seemed impossible 2 centuries ago, the flood, the divine kings, the sudden rise of civilization, have each found echoes in archaeology and geology. Myth has a way of turning into fact once enough time has passed for evidence to catch up. The line between them isn't a wall, it's a moving horizon. And perhaps that's why these ancient stories still command attention. They are not frozen in the past. They continue to evolve, to be reinterpreted, to mirror the questions of each age. In the 19th century, they were treated as curiosities. In the 20th, they became the foundation for the ancient astronaut hypothesis. In the 21st, they've become part of a broader search for meaning, a bridge between science and spirituality, history and imagination. Every interpretation reveals more about us than about them. The myths survive because they adapt, and because the need to connect with our beginnings never disappears. For the Sumerians, the gods were not metaphors but explanations for the impossible. The sudden leap from survival to civilization. For us, they are reminders that knowledge itself has always arrived as a mystery. Whether one believes the Anunnaki were divine beings, extraterrestrial visitors, or the personifications of human potential, the result is the same. They mark the moment humanity became self-aware. They represent the beginning of history as an act of reflection. Before the gods, there were no records. After them, everything became story. Between myth and history lies the memory of transformation. The flood is no longer just a divine punishment. It's an echo of natural catastrophe. The descent of the gods is no longer just divine visitation. It's the story of awakening, of consciousness breaking through instinct. The creation of humanity is no longer a supernatural event. It's the symbolic expression of a species realizing it has purpose. Myth, in this sense, is not false history. It's the first form of history humanity ever wrote. When the last cuneiform tablets were pressed and the scribes laid down their styluses, they believed they were preserving knowledge for eternity. What they could not have known is that the language itself would vanish for millennia, that the gods they praised would become shadows, and that someday their stories would be rediscovered by a world that no longer understood the unity they once lived within. And yet, across those thousands of years, their voices still speak, not as superstition, but as testimony. The distinction between myth and history may be a modern invention, a line drawn out of habit rather than truth. The ancients never asked where one ended and the other began, because they knew both were part of the same thing. The effort to remember, to look back, is to stand in both worlds at once, to see the reflection of gods in the ruins of cities, and the reflection of humanity in the faces of its gods. Somewhere between those reflections, history began, and the myth of the Anunnaki, the story of when gods ruled the earth, became the first record of us trying to understand what we are. And so, even now, we walk that same line. We uncover their cities, read their symbols, and debate their meaning, always hovering between certainty and wonder. The clay tablets crumble, but the story endures. Because between myth and history, between what is remembered and what is believed, lies the oldest truth humanity ever told. That we are the children of something greater, and we have spent every age trying to remember what that something was. Long before any prophecy or modern theory spoke of a return, the ancients had already planted the idea in their stories. The Anunnaki did not simply vanish at the end of their reign, they withdrew. Their departure was not described as an ending, but as a pause, a transition. They left behind temples, knowledge and instruction, promising that the time of their return would come when the order of the heavens called them back. To the people who lived in those early ages, that promise wasn't a metaphor. It was a real expectation. Every generation after the flood looked to the sky not in superstition but in waiting. The gods had once walked the earth. There was no reason to believe they wouldn't do so again. As centuries passed, the world changed, but the anticipation remained. The Sumerians had spoken of Enki's wisdom returning in a time of renewal. The Babylonians said that when the star of Marduk crossed the sky again, balance would be restored. The Egyptians believed that Osiris would rise from the underworld to guide a new age. Even the Hebrews, inheriting fragments of older traditions, spoke of a moment when heaven and earth would meet once more, when divine beings would descend and walk among men. The names shifted, but the structure was constant. There had been a time of contact, there would be one again. To the ancient mind, the cosmos was cyclical. Nothing was final. Stars rose, fell, and returned. Empires did the same. Floods came and receded, and the world rebuilt itself. Time moved not as a line, but as a spiral. The gods were part of that motion, absent for an age, present for another, their influence waxing and waning like celestial bodies. To say the gods would return was not prophecy. It was simply the recognition of rhythm. In the ruins of Mesopotamia, among tablets shattered and half-buried, there are hymns that speak of the divine departure. The language is mournful, not fearful. The scribes wrote of temples abandoned, of offerings left unanswered, of the silence that followed when the voices of the Anunnaki ceased to speak. But even in that silence, they heard promise. The texts describe how the holy ones have gone to the far heavens, yet their eyes are upon the earth. The gods had not abandoned creation, they had stepped beyond it. They had gone back to the sky, to the place they came from. For those who read these words through the lens of ancient astronaut theory, the description takes on a different meaning. If the Anunnaki were travellers from another world, their departure was literal. They completed their work, withdrew to their origin, and left humanity to grow. The return, then, would not be a spiritual renewal, but a physical event, the reappearance of the same beings who had once set foot on Earth. The Sumerians said they ruled for thousands of years, their lives measured not in decades but in cycles. If they came from beyond, their perception of time would have been different from ours. 1,000 years to them could be an interval. Their absence, from our perspective, would be endless. From theirs, it might be the blink of an eye. In the Enuma Elish, after Marduk defeats Tiamat and sets the cosmos in motion, he establishes stations for the gods and fixes their orbits. He gives each deity a position in the heavens and decrees that their movements will dictate the fate of the earth. The implication is clear. When the heavens shift, so too does the balance of power on earth. The idea of return, then, is not random, it's cosmic alignment. When the stars return to their former positions, so too do the gods who rule them. The Babylonians track these cycles meticulously. Their astronomical tablets record movements spanning centuries, tracing conjunctions of planets and stars with mathematical precision. To them, the heavens were a schedule of divine activity. Every event on Earth, from war to harvest, mirrored the motion of the sky. The return of certain stars was celebrated as the renewal of divine presence. Nibiru, the crossing point, was central to this pattern. It symbolized transition, the place where the gods passed between worlds. When it appeared, something always changed. In that rhythm, the promise of a return was not superstition, it was observation, but even outside Mesopotamia the same belief persisted. The Maya recorded that their gods came from the stars and would return when the calendar completed its great cycle. The Hopi spoke of ancestors who descended in fiery shields and promised to come again at the end of an age. The Egyptians carved into their temple walls the prophecy of the first time returning, the moment when the gods would once again walk the earth. The Greeks looked to the stars and said that the golden age would come back, when Saturn ruled the heavens as it once did. These were not isolated myths. They were fragments of a single human expectation that history repeats, that contact renews. As modernity grew and science replaced myth, the language of that expectation changed, but the longing remained. The gods of old became visitors from the cosmos. Their chariots became ships. Their thunder became propulsion. Their departure became departure in the literal sense, leaving the earth for the stars. And their return became a possibility that astronomers, writers, and dreamers continued to search for, not through temples and rituals, but through telescopes and data. The fascination with return gained new life in the 20th century, when humanity first broke through its own sky. As rockets rose, as satellites orbited, as the first photographs of Earth from space appeared, the boundary between heaven and earth finally thinned again. For the first time since the ancient world, people could look down from above and see what the gods might have seen. The image of Earth hanging in the void stirred something buried, an old recognition. The view from space was not invention, it was remembrance. Humanity had finally reached the threshold its ancestors had described, though it arrived there through machines instead of myth. At the same time, new interpretations of ancient texts began to surface. Writers like Zecharia Sitchin revisited the Sumerian tablets and argued that they described not divine beings, but extraterrestrial visitors from Nibiru, a planet on a vast elliptical orbit. According to this reading, the Anunnaki's return would be tied to the reappearance of that world in our solar system. When it came close again, the gods would come with it. Whether one agrees or not, the idea struck a deep chord. It merged the scientific and the sacred, the precision of astronomy with the poetry of prophecy. For some, it offered explanation. For others, reassurance. The gods had not vanished. They were simply waiting for the right alignment to come back. But the question of return isn't only physical. In every era of decline, humanity rediscovers the same longing, the sense that something vital has gone missing and must be restored. When cultures face uncertainty, the stories of divine return resurface. They act as mirrors of our collective desire for renewal, for guidance, for meaning. The gods, in that sense, never have to descend from the heavens to return. They reappear within the human imagination, taking form in whatever language the age understands, as deities, as ideals, as cosmic travellers, as truths rediscovered. Across the ancient world, return also meant restoration of balance. The Sumerians believed that when the gods withdrew, they took part of the me, the laws that held creation in order, with them. What remained was imperfect, unstable. Each generation lived further from the harmony of the first age. The return of the gods would therefore be a restoration of the me in full, the return of equilibrium between heaven and earth. In modern terms, it would mean the reawakening of forgotten knowledge, the reconnection between the human and the cosmic. This idea appears again in later texts that drew from Mesopotamian roots. The Hebrew prophets spoke of a time when the glory of the Lord will fill the earth as the waters cover the sea. The Greek philosophers wrote of anamnesis, the recollection of divine truth lost to time. Even in later mystical traditions, from the Gnostics to the Hermetics, there is always a call to remember. The return of the gods in this light is not a literal arrival, but a return of awareness, the moment when humanity remembers where it came from. Still, the ancient stories never entirely lose their physical imagery. The gods of Sumer did not float as abstractions. They arrived in vessels, built cities, and departed in sight of men. Their temples were practical structures, their instructions specific. When they left, they didn't dissolve into metaphor, they ascended. The tablets say, the gods flew away like birds, and they returned to the heavens by the road of the sky. It's easy to see how such descriptions, preserved for millennia, could fuel both faith and speculation. Modern science may not accept such accounts as literal, but it does echo them in unexpected ways. The search for life beyond Earth, in exoplanets, in the icy moons of Jupiter and Saturn, in the far reaches of our galaxy, is, in a sense, the search for the gods by another name. Each discovery of a potentially habitable world, each signal studied, each theory of panspermia, all of it circles back to the same idea the Sumerians wrote in clay, that life did not begin here alone, that the heavens are not empty, and that what came before may come again. In a broader sense, the return of the gods is already happening, not through sky chariots or thrones of light, but through the reawakening of the very knowledge they were said to have given. The modern world, in rediscovering the mathematics, astronomy and engineering that the ancients attributed to divine instruction, is reliving that contact. Each technological advancement, each new understanding of the cosmos, brings humanity closer to the same threshold the Sumerians once stood upon, the meeting point of human creation and divine inheritance. The gods, if they were ever real, may not need to return from the stars. They return every time a human hand reaches upward and builds something that touches the sky. The concept of return also carries an emotional weight that transcends any specific belief. It speaks to the human need for continuity, for reassurance that the story is not finished. In times of uncertainty, when civilizations falter or knowledge seems to fade, the old expectation comes back to life. The gods will return. Order will be restored. The balance between heaven and earth will be renewed. Whether one takes it literally or symbolically, it's a story of hope disguised as prophecy. Even the language of modern science sometimes mirrors this old longing. When researchers talk about the cyclical nature of the universe, expansion, collapse, rebirth, they echo the same rhythm the Sumerians saw in the heavens. The idea that creation and destruction are part of an ongoing cycle is as old as civilization itself. The gods, in their endless motion, were never gone. They were simply on the other side of the cycle, waiting to emerge again when the time was right. If there is truth in the ancient idea of return, it may not happen all at once. The texts speak of signs, of shifts in the heavens, of changes in the order of the world, of humanity preparing itself for the next stage. The Sumerians saw knowledge as the first sign of divine favour. Perhaps in that sense the rediscovery of their stories is itself a kind of return. Every tablet unearthed, every word translated, every forgotten name spoken aloud again, all of it is part of the same motion, the same spiral. The gods are returning not because they are descending from the sky, but because we are remembering them. And as humanity once more looks to the stars, building machines that leave the planet, reaching further each decade, we are beginning to step into the same role the gods once held. The creation of life in laboratories, the manipulation of genes, the shaping of worlds through technology, all echo the acts once attributed to the Anunnaki. In that sense, the return may not be theirs, but ours. The children of the gods becoming the gods themselves, completing the circle that began in the cradle of civilization. What the Sumerians saw as divine descent, we now see as human ascent. The two are the same motion viewed from opposite ends of time. The gods came down, humanity rises up. Somewhere between those two arcs the story continues. And in that continuation lies the quiet truth the ancients seem to know, that creation is never finished, that the boundary between heaven and earth is only ever temporary, and that every ending is just another beginning in the endless return of what once was divine. Long after the last temples fell silent and the names of the gods faded from daily speech, their presence never truly disappeared. It remained in fragments, in words, in symbols, in the quiet structure of how humanity continued to think about itself and the universe. The Anunnaki may have vanished from the living memory of their cities, but they persisted in the framework of civilization itself. Every culture that rose afterward inherited some fragment of their story, reshaped it, and carried it forward without knowing the origin. That's what happens when an idea becomes too old to trace. It doesn't vanish. It dissolves into everything that comes after. By the time the last cuneiform tablets were pressed, the story had already become invisible history. The languages that followed, Aramaic, Greek, Latin, still carried echoes of Sumerian thought, though the people speaking them no longer recognized it. The very structure of gods living among men, the idea of divine order shaping society, and the belief that knowledge itself was a sacred inheritance, all of it began there. The divine kingships of Egypt, the pantheons of Greece and Rome, the angelic hierarchies of later Abrahamic faiths, each one was a refraction of the same older truth. They changed names, they changed rituals, but the foundation remained untouched. The old stories of heaven meeting earth simply kept finding new ways to be told. The farther those ideas travelled, the more human they became. The gods of stone and sky slowly turned into archetypes of behaviour, forces of personality, moral lessons. The gods who had once built cities now lived in the hearts of their worshippers. The transition wasn't sudden. It was a slow transformation shaped by language and distance. But it shows something profound, that what began as divine history gradually became internal history. Humanity absorbed the myth of the gods into itself. The divine no longer had to walk on the earth because the memory of divinity had become part of human consciousness. The first people to look back and interpret myth as history did not realize they were also uncovering the story of their own evolution. When scholars began translating the tablets of Sumer, they expected legend. What they found were records, not only of trade and taxes, but of cosmology, of origins, of divine governance. The Anunnaki weren't described as distant abstractions. They were administrators, architects, engineers of life. Whether or not one believes they were literal beings, the description reveals something universal, that humanity has always sensed that its story began with intervention, with help from beyond its own capacity. The ancient words are less about gods descending and more about awakening, the moment when humans became aware of themselves as creators within creation. The echo of that awakening has never stopped. It can be heard in every period of rediscovery. When the Greeks developed philosophy, they described it as remembering what the soul already knew. When the scientists of the Renaissance studied nature, they spoke of uncovering the divine code. When modern physics began to unravel the structure of reality, it found the same pattern the ancients spoke of. Unity beneath multiplicity, order within chaos. Each new age has tried to explain it in its own language, but the underlying recognition is the same. Existence is not random. It is designed, deliberate, and connected. The ancients expressed that understanding as gods. We call it physics, biology, or consciousness. The names change, but the structure of awe remains identical. The echo of the divine also exists in the way civilizations measure time. The Sumerians divided the heavens into 12 sections, each ruled by a constellation, each marking a cycle of roughly 2,000 years, the precession of the equinoxes. Their division of time shaped everything that followed. The 12 months, the 12 hours, the 12 signs of the zodiac. For them, this wasn't mathematics, it was sacred rhythm. Each age brought the rise and fall of empires and the shifting of divine influence. To live within a particular age was to live under the guardianship of a particular celestial force. That way of thinking never ended. It simply evolved into astrology, into astronomy, into the calendar itself. We still live inside their structure, measuring our lives by the same heavenly order they once read as the language of the gods. The idea that eternity echoes through time isn't mystical, it's observable. Everything repeats in some form. Stars die and scatter their matter, which becomes the seed of new stars and planets. Civilizations collapse, and from their remnants, others rise, carrying forward fragments of memory. Ideas vanish in one form and resurface in another centuries later. Even the myths of the Anunnaki, long buried and forgotten, were rediscovered in the last 2 centuries, translated, studied, and spoken aloud again after lying silent for nearly 4,000 years. That rediscovery is itself an echo. the voice of the past reaching through time, reshaping the present. When scholars first read the Sumerian accounts of creation, they realized how familiar they were. The same flood, the same garden, the same forbidden knowledge, the same descent from heaven, all appeared in later scriptures across the world. What we call different religions might be seen as branches of a single older tree whose roots reach back to Sumer. The echo of those stories didn't just travel through words, it travelled through symbols, rituals and architecture. The form of the ziggurat became the model for the pyramid, and later for the mountain temples of Asia and the stepped structures of Mesoamerica. The temple as a bridge between heaven and earth, that was the enduring shape of the divine idea. Humanity kept building the same structure again and again across continents and millennia because it carried the same ancestral memory of what it meant to connect with the sky. If the Anunnaki were real beings, as some believe, their legacy would not just be physical, it would be psychological. They would be embedded in the human instinct to build, to explore, to remember. The impulse to reach upward, whether through architecture, science, or spirituality, might be the deepest form of that inheritance. The gods once reached down, now humanity reaches up. Each age reflects the other. The echo of eternity moves both ways. Even the belief in divine justice, the idea that moral order mirrors cosmic order, begins in these early stories. The Sumerians spoke of me, the divine decrees that govern existence. The Babylonians called it destiny, the Greeks called it logos, the Hebrews called it law. Each civilization rephrased the same insight, that the universe is bound by principles that reflect balance. Humanity's task was to live in alignment with that balance. The flood myths, for all their destruction, were not punishments, but restorations. The world was washed to reset the equilibrium. The echo of that principle persists in every moral system since. When societies falter, when order decays, the instinct to reset, to begin again, is a reflection of that same ancient rhythm. In the modern world, the idea of eternity might sound abstract, but to the ancients it was tangible. They saw it in the stars, in the cycles of agriculture, in the turning of seasons, in the procession of kings. Eternity wasn't infinite time, it was recurrence, the repetition of patterns that ensured the world continued. The gods were embodiments of those patterns. When they acted, they were performing the cosmic cycle in human terms. The myths of their battles, loves, and decrees were dramatizations of natural law. What we call mythology was their physics, their cosmology written in story instead of symbol. And because story is easier to remember than equation, those truths survived. Every time humanity rediscovers the past, it also rediscovers itself. When the tablets of Sumer were translated, they didn't just reveal ancient knowledge, they revealed continuity. They showed that civilization has been asking the same questions since the beginning. Where we come from, why we're here, whether we're alone. The difference between then and now lies only in the language we use to ask. What they called the will of the gods, we call evolution or probability. What they described as divine breath, we call consciousness. What they saw as fate, we call physics. The echo of eternity is the constancy of curiosity, the relentless human need to understand. For those who still hold to the idea that the gods were more than myth, the rediscovery of their story may not be coincidence. It could be the signal of another cycle, another return. The gods of the first civilization are being remembered again, not as superstition, but as history. Their names, once buried, are spoken aloud by millions who had never heard of Sumer a century ago. The digital age has become a new kind of temple, where information replaces stone and memory spreads faster than ever before. In that sense, the gods never needed to return physically. Humanity brought them back by uncovering their words, by sharing their story, by breathing life into their memory once again. The echo continues in the way modern culture depicts the divine. Films, books, and art still imagine beings from the sky-shaping worlds, teaching humanity, watching from afar. We may call them aliens, higher intelligences, or interdimensional travellers, but they carry the same essence as the Anunnaki. The human mind hasn't stopped creating gods. It has simply updated the language to fit the age. The stories of creation and return now unfold through science fiction instead of scripture, but they play the same role, to remind us that we are part of something larger, older, and recurring. If eternity is an echo, then humanity itself is part of that reverberation. Every invention, every rediscovery, every act of imagination is a repetition of the first awakening, the moment when the gods, or whoever they truly were, first gave humanity the tools to build and to think. That echo doesn't fade, it multiplies. Each generation adds its own layer of resonance, shaping how the original sound is remembered. The gods may have spoken once, but humanity has been responding ever since. In that response lies the true continuation of their legacy. The temples we build today are made of knowledge, observatories, laboratories, data networks, each one dedicated to understanding the universe they once described through story. The act of seeking truth, of mapping the stars, of decoding creation, is the modern ritual of communion with the divine. The ancients performed it through offerings and hymns. We perform it through exploration and inquiry. The form has changed, but the intention hasn't. We're still trying to reach the same understanding, that we are both product and participant of a cosmic order that existed before us and will continue after us. In the end, the echo of eternity is not about gods or myths alone. It's about continuity, the unbroken line of thought that connects the first story ever told to the questions we still ask. The Anunnaki, whether as beings or symbols, represent that line. They stand at the threshold between the human and the divine, between memory and imagination. Their story is not about the past, but about persistence. The way ideas live longer than civilizations. The way meaning survives when structures collapse. Somewhere in the ruins of Sumer, beneath layers of earth and time, there are still tablets that no one has read. Each one holds another voice, another detail of how the ancients saw their place in the universe. Every fragment that surfaces adds another tone to the echo. It's impossible to say when it will fade, because it hasn't. It continues in the languages we speak, in the systems we use, in the way we look to the sky, not only for weather or navigation, but for purpose. The gods may not rule the earth anymore, but their story rules the imagination that builds it. That might be the truest form of eternity. Not infinite duration, but infinite remembrance. As long as humanity exists, the echo of those first voices will continue to shape what we create, what we believe, and what we search for. The Anunnaki, the architects of civilization, became more than their names. They became the pattern itself. The idea that the universe has intention, that knowledge comes from contact, and that memory is the bridge between the mortal and the divine. And so the story never truly ends. It reverberates, as every generation rediscovers the same questions, the same longing, the same gaze upward. The gods, once rulers of the earth, now live in the rhythm of thought itself, in every search for meaning, in every act of creation, in every voice that dares to remember. That is the echo of eternity, not the sound of what once was, but the continuation of what never stopped speaking.